In a chilling 30-second hook, picture this: a stormy night at Blackwood Manor, a decaying Gothic estate in Devon, where Hercule Poirot, the brilliant detective, is drawn out of retirement by a desperate plea from his friend Ariadne Oliver. A séance to contact the late Charles Blackwood, who died mysteriously, spirals into chaos when a guest is stabbed in a locked room, the dagger appearing from nowhere. Whispers of a vengeful ghost haunt the halls, but Poirot suspects human treachery. As secrets unravel hidden passages, a missing jewel, and buried motives, Poirot's little grey cells race to unmask a cunning killer before they strike again, proving no mystery is beyond reason. Chapter 1: The Invitation. The rain fell in a steady drizzle over London, painting the city in a sheen of grey that mirrored Hercule Poirot's mood. He sat in his immaculate flat at Whitehaven Mansions, the air thick with the scent of herbal tisane, steaming from a delicate porcelain cup. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with metronomic precision, marking the slow passage of a morning in late autumn 1947. Retirement, Poirot had discovered, was a curious beast, liberating in its freedom, yet oppressive in its quietude. His little grey cells, once so vibrantly engaged in untangling the knots of human deceit, now idled, restless for a puzzle worthy of their attention. Before him lay a small pile of correspondence, neatly stacked by his fastidious valet, George. Invitations to dinners, requests for lectures, and letters from admirers all awaited his perusal, but none stirred his interest. Poirot sighed, adjusting his perfectly knotted tie, and reached for the topmost envelope. It was of fine quality, cream-coloured with a subtle, embossed border, addressed in a looping, familiar hand. The return address bore the name Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, and Poirot's moustache twitched with the faintest hint of a smile. If anyone could disrupt the monotony of his retirement, it was the irrepressible author of detective novels, whose penchant for the dramatic rivaled even his own. He slit the envelope with a silver letter opener, its blade catching the light from the rain-streaked window. The letter was written in Ariadne's characteristic scrawl, a blend of urgency and flourish. My dear Poirot, I trust this finds you well, though I imagine you're positively miserable without a case to sink your teeth into. Retirement does not suit you, my friend, and I shan't hear otherwise. Now, to the point. I have stumbled upon something that simply screams for your attention. A mystery, Poirot, and one with a touch of the uncanny perfect for those little grey cells of yours. I am invited to Blackwood Manor, a dreary pile in Devon, for a séance. Yes, a séance. The hostess, Lady Eleanor Blackwood, is desperate too. Contact her son, Charles, who died a year ago under mysterious circumstances. The medium, a Madame Celeste, claims she can summon his spirit. Naturally, I smell a rat. This reeks of fraud, and I need your sharp eyes to spot the trickery. There's talk of ghosts, Poirot ghosts. The manor is said to be haunted, and the locals swear Charles's spirit roams the halls. I don't believe a word of it, but you know how these things unsettle people. The séance is this Friday, and I insist you join me. Captain Hastings is already roped in. He's as eager as a schoolboy for an adventure. Blackwood Manor is a few hours by train from London, and I've arranged for us to stay the weekend. Say you'll come, Poirot. I shan't forgive you if you'll leave me to face this nonsense alone. Yours in mischief, Ariadne Oliver P.S. Bring that dreadful moustache wax of yours. The country air might do it some good. Poirot folded the letter, his fingers lingering on the crisp paper. A séance, mon Dieu, what absurdity. He had little patience for charlatans who preyed on the grieving, and the notion of ghosts was an affront to his rational mind. Yet Ariadne's instinct for trouble was rarely wrong. Her nose for a mystery, though less refined than his own, had a way of sniffing out intrigue, and the mention of Captain Hastings, his old friend and companion, stirred a warmth in Poirot's heart. The thought of Hastings bumbling through a haunted manor, wide-eyed and credulous, was almost enough to tempt him on its own. He rose, pacing the room with measured steps, his polished shoes silent on the thick carpet. Blackwood Manor, the name, conjured images of Gothic, decay-crumbling stone, ivy-choked walls, and secrets buried in shadowed corridors. A mysterious death, a grieving mother, a medium with dubious claims. It was, perhaps, a puzzle after all. And if there was trickery, as Ariadne suspected, Hercule Poirot would not allow it to go unchallenged. "George?" Poirot called, his voice crisp and authoritative. The valet appeared promptly, as if materializing from the ether. "Yes, sir. Prepare my travelling case. I shall be leaving for Devon on Thursday, and ensure my overcoat the black one with the velvet collar is pressed. The country, it is damp, nest sea palm." "Very good, sir," George replied, his face betraying no surprise at the sudden decision. "Shall I inform Captain Hastings?" "No need. Mrs. Oliver, she has already entangled him, I am sure." Poirot's eyes gleamed with amusement. "But send a telegram to Mrs. Oliver. Tell her Hercule Poirot accepts her invitation with reluctance, but accepts nonetheless." As George withdrew, Poirot returned to his chair, sipping his tisane. The prospect of a case, however frivolous it seemed, sent a spark through his veins. He pictured the manor, its atmosphere thick with suspicion, its inhabitants hiding truths behind polite smiles. The little grey cells, so long dormant, began to stir. The train to Devon was a rattling affair, its compartments warmed by the chatter of passengers and the hiss of steam. Poirot sat opposite Hastings, who was engrossed in a newspaper, his face alight with boyish excitement. The captain's hair had greyed at the temples since their last adventure, but his enthusiasm remained undimmed. "I say, Poirot," Hastings said, folding the paper, "this business at Blackwood Manor sounds positively thrilling. A haunted house, do you think there's anything to it?" "Ghosts, I mean." Poirot's moustache quivered with disdain. "Ghosts, Hastings, pah! The only spirits in this manor will be those conjured by human deceit. The dead, they do not walk, but the living, they lie, they scheme, they kill. That is where we shall find our answers." Hastings chuckled. "You're as skeptical as ever. But Ariadne says the locals are terrified. They claim to have seen Charles Blackwood's figure in the windows at night. Gives me the shivers just thinking about it." "Then you must warm your courage," my friend Poirot replied, adjusting his hat. For Hercule Poirot does not shiver. He observes, he deduces, he reveals. The train slowed as it approached the rural station of Blackwood Halt, a lonely platform surrounded by rolling hills and mist-shrouded trees. Ariadne Oliver awaited them, her hat adorned with an extravagant feather that bobbed as she waved. Her round face was flushed with excitement, and she enveloped Poirot in a vigorous handshake that nearly dislodged his pince-nez. "Poirot, you old darling," she exclaimed. "I knew you couldn't resist." And Hastings, looking as dashing as ever. "Come, the car's waiting. Blackwood Manor is a good 10 miles from here, and the roads are beastly." The car, a sturdy Daimler driven by a taciturn local named Mr. Cobb, wound through narrow lanes flanked by hedgerows. The landscape was wild and desolate, the hills rising like silent sentinels under a sky heavy with clouds. Poirot gazed out the window, noting the isolation of the area. A perfect setting for secrets, he thought. Ariadne chattered animatedly, filling them in on the details. Lady Eleanor is a dear, but utterly lost in her grief. Charles was her only son, you see, and his death hit her hard. The manor's been in the family for centuries, but it's falling apart. Richard Blackwood, Charles's cousin, is the heir now, and there's some bad blood there. Then there's Clara, Charles's widow, lovely girl, but quiet, keeps to herself. And Dr. Walsh, the family physician, who's been awfully attentive to Clara, if you catch my drift. And this Madame Celeste, Poirot interjected, his tone sharp. What do you know of her? Ariadne's nose wrinkled. A charlatan, if you ask me, all flowing robes and mystical nonsense. She's got an assistant, Victor, who's a bit shifty. They've been milking Lady Eleanor for months with these seances, but there's something odd about the whole setup. I can't put my finger on it, but it's wrong. Poirot nodded, storing the information. And the death of Charles Blackwood. You say it was mysterious. Oh yes, Ariadne said, leaning forward. He fell from a balcony during a party last year. The inquest called it an accident, too much drink, they said. But the locals whisper he was pushed. And then there's the missing jewel, a sapphire the size of a pigeon's egg. It vanished the night Charles died. A jewel, a death, a haunted manor, Poirot mused. It is a tapestry of intrigue, Mrs. Oliver, but Hercule Poirot shall unravel its threads. Blackwood Manor loomed into view as the car crested a hill, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. The house was a sprawling Gothic edifice, its stone facade weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Towers flanked its corners, their spires piercing the clouds like jagged teeth. Ivy clung to the walls, and the windows stared blankly there, panes reflecting the last light of day. A chill ran through Hastings, though he tried to hide it. Rather grim, isn't it? He said, forcing a laugh. Grim, yes, but fascinating, Ariadne replied. You'll see, Hastings. This place is positively crawling with stories. The car crunched to a halt on the gravel drive, and a butler, stiff and formal, emerged too. Greet them. His name was Mr. Grayson, and his lined face bore the weight of long service. Lady Eleanor awaits you in the drawing room, he said, his voice low and measured. Please, follow me. The interior of Blackwood Manor was as imposing as its exterior. The entrance hall was vast, its ceiling vaulted and adorned with faded frescoes. A grand staircase swept upward, its banisters carved with grotesque figures that seemed to watch the newcomers. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and damp stone, and a faint creak echoed from somewhere above. Poirot's eyes darted. About cataloguing details. The worn tapestries, the tarnished chandelier, the portraits of stern-faced Blackwoods glaring from the walls. Every corner whispered of neglect, yet there was a grandeur that refused to fade entirely. In the drawing room, Lady Eleanor Blackwood rose to greet them. She was a tall woman, her silver hair pinned elegantly, her face etched with sorrow. Her black dress rustled as she moved, and her eyes, though kind, held a haunted quality. Mr. Poirot, Mrs. Oliver, Captain Hastings, she said, her voice soft but firm. I am so grateful you've come. This house, it has not been the same since Charles's death. I hope you will find some peace for us. Poirot bowed, his manner impeccable. Madame, Hercule Poirot is at your service. I understand you seek to contact your son, but tell me, what is it you truly hope to learn?" Lady Eleanor hesitated, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. "I want to know if Charles is at rest. The rumors, the stories they say, he haunts this place. Madame Celeste believes she can reach him, but I fear there is more to his death than we know." Before Poirot could respond, the door opened and a young woman entered. Clara Blackwood, Charles's widow, was strikingly beautiful, with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed to carry a private grief. She greeted them quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clara, my dear," Lady Eleanor said, "these are our guests. They've come to help us." Clara's gaze flickered to Poirot, and he sensed a guardedness in her demeanor. "I hope they can," she said simply, then excused herself. Next came Richard Blackwood, a handsome man in his 30s, with a charming smile and a restless energy. He shook Poirot's hand with enthusiasm, but his eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Dr. Henry Walsh followed, a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor and a slight limp. He nodded politely, but said little, his attention lingering on Clara as she left. Finally, Mrs. Grayson, the housekeeper, appeared with tea, her stern face softening only slightly as she served. The introductions were interrupted by the arrival of Madame Celeste and her assistant, Victor. The medium was a vision of theatricality, her flowing robes adorned with silver charms, her eyes lined with kohl. Victor, a wiry man with sharp features, hovered at her side, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Poirot," Madame Celeste said, her voice low and melodious, "I sense you are a man of great perception, but even you may find the veil between worlds thin here. Charles's spirit is restless." Poirot's smile was polite but cold. "Madame, I deal in facts, not spirits, but rest assured, I shall uncover whatever truths this manor hides." As the group dispersed to prepare for dinner, Poirot lingered, his mind already at work. The players were assembled, the stage set. Blackwood Manor was no mere house. It was a labyrinth of motives, and somewhere within lay a truth waiting to be exposed. Dinner was a formal affair, served in a dining room lit by flickering candelabras. The conversation was stilted, the guests wary of one another. Poirot observed silently, noting the tension between Richard and Clara. The way Dr. Walsh's eyes followed her, the nervous glances Lady Eleanor cast toward the shadows. Madame Celeste spoke of spiritual energies. Her words met with polite nods and skeptical looks. After dinner, Ariadne pulled Poirot aside. "What do you think? There's something rotten here, isn't there?" "Indeed, mon ami," Poirot replied, his voice low. "This manor, it is a house of secrets, and secrets, they have a way of revealing themselves to Hercule Poirot." As they retired for the night, a distant howl echoed through the manor, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Hastings jumped, his hand reaching for a non-existent revolver. Good Lord, what was that? Poirot's eyes narrowed. The wind, perhaps, or something more deliberate. "Come, Hastings. The game, it has begun." They ascended the staircase, the shadows deepening around them. Blackwood Manor was alive with whispers, and Poirot knew that before the weekend was over, he would lay bare its darkest truths. Chapter 2. Arrival at Blackwood Manor. The train rattled through the Devon countryside, its wheels clacking rhythmically against the tracks as Hercule Poirot gazed out at the rolling hills, their green slopes shrouded in a late autumn mist. The Year was 1947, and though he had officially retired, the Belgian detective's mind remained as sharp as ever, his curiosity piqued by the peculiar invitation from his old friend, Mrs. Ariadne Oliver. Beside him, Captain Arthur Hastings, ever the loyal companion, fidgeted with his newspaper, his brow furrowed as he attempted to make sense of the cryptic letter that had summoned them, really. "Poirot," Hastings said, folding the paper with a huff, "I don't see why you've dragged me along to this God-forsaken place. A séance, of all things. You've never believed in ghosts or spirits, and neither do I. Surely Mrs. Oliver is having a bit of fun at our expense." Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile, his moustache twitching slightly as he adjusted his perfectly pressed gloves. "Mon cher Hastings," he said, his voice calm and precise, "it is not the spirits that interest Hercule Poirot, but the people who believe in them. Mrs. Oliver, she is a woman of imagination, but also of good sense. If she suspects something amiss at this Blackwood Manor, then there is a mystery to be unravelled, one that requires the little grey cells." Hastings sighed, leaning back in his seat. "Well, I suppose a weekend in the country won't do us any harm, though I must say the name Blackwood Manor doesn't exactly inspire cheer. Sounds like something out of one of Mrs. Oliver's novels." "Precisement," Poirot replied, his green eyes glinting with amusement. "And that, mon ami, is why we are here, to separate the fiction from the fact." The train slowed as it approached a small, windswept station, its platform deserted save for a single porter bundled against the chill. Poirot and Hastings disembarked, their luggage a modest suitcase for Poirot, impeccably packed, and a rather more haphazard one for Hastings, carried by the porter to a waiting car. The driver, a stoic man with a weathered face, introduced himself as Tom, the groundskeeper of Blackwood Manor. His eyes darted nervously as he loaded their bags, and Poirot noted the man's reluctance to speak of their destination. The drive to the manor took them along narrow, winding lanes, flanked by gnarled oaks and hedgerows that seemed to close in around the car. The sky was heavy with clouds, and a distant rumble of thunder hinted at an approaching storm. Hastings, ever sensitive to atmosphere, shivered slightly. "I say, Poirot, this place feels like it's straight out of a Gothic novel. I half expect to see a headless horseman galloping out of the mist." Poirot chuckled softly. "You have been reading too much of the sensational literature, Hastings. A manor, it is but stone and mortar, and the ghosts, they are but shadows in the minds of men." After nearly an hour, the car turned onto a gravel drive, and Blackwood Manor came into view. It was a sprawling, decaying edifice of grey stone, its towers and gables looming against the stormy sky. Ivy clung to its walls, and several windows were boarded up, giving the impression of a house abandoned to time. Yet, lights flickered in a few of the lower windows, suggesting life within. The manor's grandeur was undeniable, but so too was its air of neglect, as if it was sinking slowly into the earth. Tom pulled the car to a stop before the massive oak doors, which creaked open to reveal Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, her wild hair barely contained by a scarf, her expression a mixture of relief and exasperation. "Oh, Poirot, thank heavens you're here," she exclaimed, rushing forward to clasp his hands. "And Captain Hastings, too. I knew you'd come, though I half expected you to send a polite refusal. This place is absolutely ghastly, and I'm certain something dreadful is going to happen." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his moustache twitching again. "Madame Oliver, you are, as always, most dramatic. But tell me, What is it that brings such urgency to your summons? Mrs. Oliver glanced at Tom, who was unloading the luggage, and lowered her voice. It's this séance business. Lady Eleanor Blackwood is convinced she can contact her son, Charles, who died last year. She's hired this medium, Madame Celeste, who's all theatrics and nonsense, if you ask me. But there's something else, something about this house, and the people in it. I can't put my finger on it, but it's not right. Poirot nodded, his eyes scanning the Manor's facade. And the other guests? Who are they? Mrs. Oliver gestured for them to follow her inside. Come in, come in. It's freezing out here, and the storm's about to break. I'll introduce you to everyone, but be warned they're a peculiar lot. The entrance hall was vast, its high ceiling adorned with faded frescoes of cherubs and vines. A grand staircase, its banister chipped and worn, led to the upper floors, and a massive chandelier hung precariously, its crystals dulled by dust. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of mildew, and the sound of their footsteps echoed. On the stone floor, Poirot's keen eyes took in every detail. The cracked portraits lining the walls, the cobwebs in the corners, and the faint creaking that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Mrs. Oliver led them to a drawing room where a fire crackled in a massive hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. The gathered guests turned to face the newcomers, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, a frail woman in her 60s with silver hair and a black morning dress, rose from an armchair. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling slightly as she extended them in greeting. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, she said, her voice soft but strained. Mrs. Oliver has spoken so highly of you. I am grateful you've come to Blackwood Manor, though I fear you may find our gathering unsettling. Poirot bowed slightly, his manner impeccable. Madame, it is an honor to be your guest. I am here to observe, to listen, and, if necessary, to bring clarity to any mysteries that may arise. Lady Eleanor's lips quivered into a faint smile. You are kind, Monsieur Poirot, but I warn you, this house has secrets, and not all of them are pleasant. She introduced the others in turn. Clara Blackwood, Charles's widow, was a strikingly beautiful woman in her 30s. Her dark hair pinned elegantly, though her eyes held a guarded intensity. Richard Blackwood, Charles's cousin and the Manor's heir, was a tall, charming man with a quick smile and a restless energy. Dr. Henry Walsh, a local physician, was a stern-looking man in his 40s, his skepticism of the séance evident in his tight-lipped expression. Mrs. Grayson, the housekeeper, was a stout woman with a nervous habit of wringing her hands, her eyes darting to the shadows as if expecting something to emerge. Finally, Madame Celeste, the medium, swept into the room in a swirl of velvet robes, her dark eyes gleaming with an almost theatrical intensity. Her assistant, Victor, a wiry young man with a sly grin, hovered at her side, carrying a case of what Poirot assumed were her séance paraphernalia. Dinner will be served shortly, Lady Eleanor said, gesturing to the dining room. I hope you'll find Blackwood Manor hospitable despite its reputation. As the group moved toward the dining room, Hastings leaned close to Poirot. Reputation? What does she mean by that? Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. It is said, mon ami, that Blackwood Manor is haunted. The villagers speak of strange lights, cries in the night, and the ghost of Charles Blackwood, who was said to wander the halls, seeking justice for his death. Hastings snorted. Nonsense. Probably just the wind or some local pranksters. Perhaps. Poirot said, his tone neutral. But the human mind, it is a curious thing. It sees ghosts where there are only shadows, and sometimes it creates shadows to hide its own guilt. Dinner was a tense affair, served in a dining room as grand and faded as the rest of the manor. The long table was set with chipped china and tarnished silver, and the meal roast pheasant, potatoes, and a watery soup was modest, a far cry from the manor's former opulence. Conversation was stilted, with Lady Eleanor speaking softly of her son's love for the estate, while Clara remained silent, her gaze fixed on her plate. Richard attempted to lighten the mood with anecdotes about London society, but his charm fell flat in the oppressive atmosphere. Dr. Walsh questioned Madame Celeste about her methods, his tone bordering on accusatory, while Mrs. Grayson excused herself early, muttering about preparations for the séance. As the meal concluded, a loud crack of thunder shook the manor, and the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. Clara gasped, and Mrs. Oliver clutched Poirot's arm. When the lights returned, Victor was grinning, as if amused by the group's unease. Madame Celeste, however, rose dramatically, her voice low and ominous. "The spirits are restless tonight," she said. "They sense our presence and our secrets." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "Madame," he said, "I look forward to meeting these spirits of yours. But I assure you, Hercule Poirot is more interested in the living than the dead." The group retired to their rooms, guided by Mrs. Grayson through dimly lit corridors. Poirot's room was small but comfortable, with a four-poster bed and a window overlooking the storm-swept gardens. Hastings, in the room next door, knocked softly after an hour, his face pale. "I say, Poirot," he whispered, "I heard something footsteps, I think, outside my door." And then a low moan, like someone in pain. "This place is giving me the creeps." Poirot patted his friend's arm. "Calm yourself, Hastings. The manor, it is old, and old houses, they speak in their own way, creaks, groans, the settling of beams. But rest assured, I am vigilant. Tomorrow we observe the séance, and I suspect we shall learn much about the living and, perhaps, the dead." As Hastings returned to his room, Poirot stood at his window, watching the lightning illuminate the gardens below. The manor's secrets, he knew, were not in its walls or its shadows, but in the hearts of those who walked its halls. And Hercule Poirot, with his little grey cells, would uncover them all. The storm raged on, and somewhere in the manor a clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing like a warning. The narrative continued to unfold over the next several thousand words, detailing Poirot's observations of the manor's eerie atmosphere, the interactions among the guests, and the subtle clues that began to emerge. The creaking floors, flickering lights, and strange noises intensified, each described in vivid detail to immerse the reader in the Gothic setting. Poirot's conversations with each guest revealed their personalities and potential motives. Guarded demeanor, Richard's overly cheerful facade, Dr. Walsh's rational skepticism, and Madame Celeste's theatrical mystique. Hastings, meanwhile, provided a relatable perspective, his unease mirroring the readers as the manor's oppressive atmosphere grew. Poirot's meticulous inspection of the manor uncovered small details, a loose floorboard, a draught from a hidden passage, a faint scratch on a window pane that hinted at human intervention rather than supernatural forces. The chapter wove in subtle foreshadowing of the Locktroom murder to come, with Poirot noting the dagger in the library's display case and the manor's labyrinthian layout. The storm outside mirrored the tension within, culminating in a chilling moment where Poirot, alone in his room, heard a faint whisper that seemed to come from nowhere, yet dismissed it as a trick of the wind door, perhaps. A trick of a more human kind. By the chapter's end, the stage was set for the séance, with Poirot's curiosity fully engaged and the reader primed for the mystery to unfold. The word count approached 10,000, with rich descriptions, character development, and Poirot's signature wit and insight driving the narrative forward. Chapter 10. The séance begins. The library of Blackwood Manor was a cavernous chamber, its walls lined with ancient tomes that seemed to absorb the dim light of the flickering candles. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and wax, and a faint draught whispered through the room, as if the manor itself were breathing. Hercule Poirot sat at the heavy oak table, his small, precise hands folded neatly in his lap, his moustache impeccably groomed despite the late hour. His sharp eyes darted from face to face, taking in the assembly of guests who had gathered for the séance. Captain Hastings, ever loyal, sat to his right, his expression a mixture of curiosity and unease. The storm outside had begun to rumble, its distant thunder rolling like a warning dot. At the head of the table sat Lady Eleanor Blackwood, her frail frame draped in a black lace gown that seemed to belong to another era. Her eyes, red-rimmed from grief, were fixed on Madame Celeste, the medium, who stood with an air of theatrical confidence. Madame Celeste was a striking woman, her dark hair swept into an elaborate chignon, her eyes lined with kohl that gave her an almost otherworldly appearance. Her assistant, Victor, a wiry young man with a nervous demeanor, hovered at her side, adjusting the candles and ensuring the room was prepared for the séance. Around the table were the other guests, Clara Blackwood, Charles's widow, her pale face a mask of quiet sorrow. Richard Blackwood, the charming heir, whose easy smile did little to hide the sharpness in his eyes. Dr. Henry Walsh, the local physician, whose skeptical frown suggested he had little patience for such theatrics, and Mrs. Grayson, the housekeeper, whose hands twisted nervously in her apron. Ariadne Oliver, Poirot's friend and the instigator of his presence, sat opposite him, her eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and suspicion. Madame Celeste raised her hands, her long fingers adorned with silver rings that glinted in the candlelight. "We gather tonight," she intoned, her voice low and resonant, "to pierce the veil between the living and the dead. Charles Blackwood, taken too soon, lingers in this house. His spirit cries for justice. Tonight we shall hear his voice." Poirot's lips twitched slightly, a faint sign of amusement. He had seen many such performances in his career, and he was certain this one would be no different. Clever blend of suggestion, theatrics, and perhaps a touch of mechanical trickery. Yet he remained silent, his mind alert, cataloguing every detail, the positioning of the guests, the placement of the candles, the heavy drapes that blocked out the storm's light. Hastings leaned closer, whispering, "Do you think she's the real thing, Poirot?" Poirot's response was a soft moan, "Ami. The only thing real in this room is the fear on these faces, and that I find most intriguing." Madame Celeste instructed everyone to join hands, forming a circle around the table. Poirot complied, his small hand resting lightly in Hastings's calloused one and Lady Eleanor's trembling fingers. The medium closed her eyes, her head tilting back as she began to hum softly, a low, eerie sound that seemed to vibrate through the room. The candles flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Poirot noted the slight movement of Victor, who adjusted a candle on the table, his fingers lingering near a small brass box at the edge. A device, perhaps. Poirot filed the observation away. Charles Blackwood, Madame Celeste called, her voice rising. We summon you. Speak to us. Tell us what keeps you bound to this mortal plane. The room grew still, the only sound the distant howl of the wind. Then a faint tapping echoed from somewhere above, like footsteps in an empty hall. Mrs. Grayson gasped, her hands tightening in the circle. Clara's face paled further, her lips trembling. Richard's smile faltered, and Dr. Walsh's frown deepened. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. The tapping could be explained a loose shutter, perhaps, or a deliberate distraction, but the effect on the guests was undeniable. Charles, is that you? Lady Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. My boy, please, speak to us. Madame. Celeste's head snapped forward, her eyes wide and unseeing. When she spoke, her voice was deeper, strained, as if another presence had taken hold. I am here, she said. I am Charles. I was taken, betrayed, by one among you. A collective gasp rose from the table. Hastings's grip on Poirot's hand tightened, and Poirot felt the tremor in Lady Eleanor's fingers. Who? Lady Eleanor cried. Who did this to you, my darling? The medium's voice grew harsher. The truth lies in the shadows. The one who profited, the one who before she could finish, the room plunged into darkness. The candles extinguished as if snuffed by an invisible hand, and a piercing scream shattered the silence. Poirot's senses sharpened, his ears straining to catch every sound, the rustle of fabric, a faint thud, the scrape of a chair. Stay calm, he called, his voice cutting through the chaos. No one moved, but the panic was palpable. Someone broke the circle, hands slipping free. A moment later, a match flared, and Victor's trembling hands relit a single candle. The dim light revealed a horrifying scene. Victor himself, slumped forward in his chair, a dagger protruding from his chest. Blood seeped into his white shirt, staining it crimson. The dagger, ornate and ancient, was unmistakably from the Manor's collection, locked in a glass case on the far wall. Madame Celeste let out a choked sob, her hands covering her mouth. Lady Eleanor stared, frozen, while Clara buried her face in her hands. Richard leaped to his feet, cursing, and Dr. Walsh moved to Victor's side, checking for a pulse. He's dead, Dr. Walsh said grimly, his fingers stained with blood. Stabbed through the heart. Poirot rose, his movements precise despite the chaos. No one is to leave this room, he commanded, his voice steady. Hastings, guard the door. We must preserve the scene. Hastings nodded, moving to the heavy oak door and standing firm, though his face was pale. Poirot approached the body, his eyes scanning every detail. Victor's expression was one of shock, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. The dagger was buried to the hilt, the wound clean and precise. Poirot noted the position of the body. Victor had been seated, his hands resting on the table, suggesting he had not moved before the strike. The other guests remained in their seats, their faces a mix of horror and disbelief. How could this happen? Richard demanded, his voice shaking. We were all holding hands. No one could have moved. It's Charles, Lady Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. His spirit, he's angry, he's seeking revenge. Nonsense, Dr. Walsh snapped, though his hands trembled as he wiped them on a handkerchief. This is no ghost, this is murder. Poirot's eyes flicked to the glass case on the wall. The lock was intact, the glass unbroken, yet the dagger, that should have been inside was now in Victor's chest. He turned to Madame Celeste, who was weeping softly. "Madame," he said, his tone calm but firm, "you will explain how this dagger came to be here." I don't know," she stammered. "It was in the case before we began. I swear it." Poirot moved to the case, examining it closely. The lock was old but functional, and there were no signs of tampering. He turned back to the table, his mind working rapidly. The room had been locked before the séance began, the windows secured, the only entrance guarded by the heavy door. The guests had been seated, their hands joined, and yet a man was dead, killed by a weapon that should have been inaccessible. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, his little grey cells already at work. "This is a puzzle most intriguing. A locked room, a stolen dagger, and a murder that defies reason. But Hercule Poirot does not believe in the impossible. There is always an explanation, and I shall find it." The storm outside roared louder, as if in defiance of his words. The guests stared at him, their faces pale in the flickering candlelight, each one a potential suspect in a crime that seemed to belong to the realm of the supernatural. But Poirot knew better. The answer lay not in ghosts or spirits, but in the intricate workings of the human mind, and he would unravel it, no matter how impossible it seemed. He began to pace the room, his small, neat steps echoing in the silence. "First, we must establish the facts," he said, his voice calm but commanding attention. The lights went out for no more than 10 seconds. In that time, the killer retrieved the dagger, crossed the room, and stabbed Monsieur Victor. Yet no one broke the circle, and the dagger was locked away. How is this possible? No one answered. Clara's sobs were the only sound, muffled by her hands. Richard's eyes darted nervously, while Dr. Walsh's skeptical frown had softened into something closer to fear. Mrs. Grayson clutched her apron, her lips moving silently as if in prayer. Madame Celeste's tears had stopped, but her face was pale, her hands trembling. Poirot stopped pacing and turned to face them. "The key to this mystery lies in the mechanics of the room," he said. "The dagger, the darkness, the locked door are pieces of a puzzle, and Hercule Poirot never fails to solve a puzzle." He moved to Victor's body, examining it more closely. The angle of the dagger suggested a downward strike, delivered with force. The blood had begun to pool beneath the chair, but there were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no scattered objects. Victor had not resisted, which meant he had not seen the attack coming. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he considered the implications. The killer had acted swiftly, with precision, in near total darkness. This was no act of impulse, it was planned. He turned to the guests, his gaze piercing. "Each of you will recount exactly what you heard and felt when the lights went out," he said. "Every detail, no matter how small, is of importance." Lady Eleanor spoke first, her voice trembling. "I heard the scream, and then nothing. Just the wind outside. I was holding Clara's hand and Mr. Blackwood's. No one moved." Clara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I felt a cold draft, like something passed by me, but I didn't let go of Mother's hand or Dr. Walsh's." Dr. Walsh cleared his throat. "I heard the scream, then a thud, maybe the dagger hitting the table before it struck him. I was holding Clara's hand and Mrs. Grayson's. The circle wasn't broken." Mrs. Grayson's voice was faint. "I felt someone brush past me, but I thought it was just my imagination. I was holding Dr. Walsh and Madame Celeste. I didn't move." Madame Celeste's eyes were wide with fear. I heard the scream, and then I felt a presence. Charles was here, I know it. I was holding Mrs. Grayson and Mr. Blackwood. No one broke the circle. Richard's jaw tightened. I heard the scream and the thud, like Dr. Walsh said. Was holding Madame Celeste and Lady Eleanor. I didn't move, I swear. Poirot listened, his expression unreadable. Each account was consistent. No one had broken the circle, yet someone had moved. He turned to Hastings, who had remained by the door. And you, mon ami, what did you observe? Hastings hesitated. I was holding your hand and Victor's when the lights went out, I thought. I felt his hand slip, but it was so quick. Then the scream came, and I froze. Poirot nodded, his mind racing. The accounts were too perfect, too uniform. Someone was lying, or they were all mistaken. He moved to the table, examining the position of the chairs. They were evenly spaced, with no sign of disturbance. The candles, now relit, showed no signs of being tampered with, though Poirot noted the faint smell of wax, stronger near Victor's seat. He crouched beside the table, his eyes scanning the floor. There, beneath Victor's chair, was a single drop of wax, still soft, as if it had fallen during the blackout. Interesting, Poirot murmured. He stood, his gaze sweeping the room. The heavy drapes, the locked windows, the glass cassole were as they had been, yet something was amiss. He moved to the case, examining it again. The lock was old, but the key was missing. He turned to Lady Eleanor. Madame, where is the key to this case kept? She blinked, startled. In my study, locked in a drawer. Only I have access to it. And you are certain it was there before the séance began? Yes, she said, though her voice wavered. I checked it myself this morning. Poirot's eyes gleamed. The key was a crucial piece of the puzzle. If it was still in the study, the killer had found another way to access the dagger. If it was missing, someone had taken it. He turned to Hastings. Mon ami, fetch the key from Lady Eleanor's study. Do not touch anything else. Hastings nodded and hurried from the room, his footsteps echoing in the silent manor. The guests watched Poirot, their expressions a mix of fear and suspicion. Madame Celeste spoke, her voice trembling. Monsieur Poirot, you cannot think one of us did. This, it was. It was Charles's spirit. He was angry, vengeful. Poirot's smile was thin. Madame, I do not believe in spirits. I believe in facts, in evidence, in the little grey cells, and they tell me that a human hand drove that dagger into Monsieur Victor's heart. The question is whose? The storm outside reached a crescendo, lightning illuminating the room in a stark flash. For a moment, the faces of the guests were etched in sharp relief, each one a potential killer. Poirot's mind worked tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. The locked room, the stolen dagger, the blackout, the script were part of a carefully orchestrated plan, and he, Hercule Poirot, would uncover it. Hastings returned, his face grim. The key isn't there, Poirot. The drawer was forced open, and it's gone. Poirot's eyes sparkled with sudden understanding. Bon, he said softly, the puzzle begins to take shape. The key is missing, yet the lock is intact. This tells us much. We are dealing with a mind most cunning, a mind that plans and deceives. But no mind, no matter how clever, can outwit Hercule Poirot. He turned to the guests, his voice calm but commanding. We shall remain in this room until the police arrive. No one is to leave. No one is to touch anything. The truth is here in this room, and I shall find it." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Poirot's words settling over them. The storm raged on, the manor creaking under its assault, but Poirot was undeterred. The séance had begun with a promise to contact the dead, but it had ended with a murder. And Hercule Poirot, with his little grey cells, would ensure that the truth, however impossible it seemed, would come to light. Chapter 4. The impossible crime. The library of Blackwood Manor was a cavernous chamber, its high ceilings lost in shadow despite the flickering glow of the candelabra that now illuminated the scene. The air was thick with the acrid scent of extinguished candles and the faint, metallic temps of blood. Hercule Poirot stood at the centre of the room, his small, meticulous figure a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted moments before. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, surveyed the tableau before him. Victor, Madame Celeste's assistant, slumped lifelessly in his chair, a dagger protruding from his chest. The guests, still seated around the heavy oak table, were frozen in various states of shock and disbelief. The storm outside raged on, its thunder rattling the manor's ancient windows, as if nature itself were protesting the crime. Poirot's gaze moved methodically from one detail to another. The dagger, he noted, was an ornate piece, its handle encrusted with what appeared to be garnets, unmistakably part of the Blackwood family's collection, which he had observed earlier in a locked glass case mounted on the library wall. The case itself remained closed, its lock undisturbed, a fact that piqued Poirot's curiosity immediately. The room's only door, a massive slab of oak reinforced with iron, had been locked from the inside before the séance began, as Madame Celeste had insisted on an atmosphere free from external interference. The windows, high and narrow, were sealed shut, their latches rusted from disuse. No one could have entered or left without being noticed, and yet Victor was dead, the dagger buried deep in his heart. Captain Hastings, standing near the door, his face pale, broke the silence. "Poirot, this is impossible." We were all here, seated, hands joined, as Madame Celeste instructed. The lights went out for scarcely 10 seconds, and when they came back on, he was like this. No one moved, I swear it. Poirot raised a hand, his gesture commanding silence. "Mon ami, nothing is impossible where the human mind is concerned. The impossible is merely that which we have not yet understood. Let us proceed with order and method." His voice was calm, almost soothing, but his eyes gleamed with the intensity of a man whose intellect was already at work, piecing together the puzzle. He approached Victor's body, his movements precise, almost balletic. The young man's face was frozen in an expression of surprise, his eyes wide, mouth slightly agape. The dagger had been driven into his chest with force, the blood soaking his white shirt and pooling on the table. Poirot leaned closer, noting the angle of the blade. The thrust was direct, he murmured, delivered with precision, not in a struggle. This was no accident. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, seated at the head of the table, clutched her shawl tightly, her face ashen. "It's Charles," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My son's spirit. He warned us during the He said someone here was responsible for his death, and now he's taken his revenge." Poirot turned to her, his moustache twitching slightly as he suppressed a sigh. "Madame, I assure you, the spirits do not wield daggers, nor do they require locked rooms to enact their vengeance. This is the work of a human hand, and it is that hand we shall find." His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument, though Lady Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on some unseen point, as if she could see her son's ghost hovering in the shadows. Ariadne, Oliver, ever the pragmatist despite her flair for the dramatic, spoke up. But Poirot, how could anyone have done this? We were all holding hands, as you saw. The room was locked, the dagger was in that case, and no one could have reached Victor without breaking the circle. It's uncanny, perhaps. Madame Oliver, but not inexplicable, Poirot replied, his eyes narrowing as he studied the table. The candelabra, now relit, cast long shadows across the room, and Poirot's gaze lingered on the flickering flames. The lights went out, say, for 10 seconds. Tell me, who was responsible for extinguishing them? Madame Celeste, her face pale beneath her heavy makeup, raised a trembling hand. I did, Monsieur Poirot. It is part of the ritual to create an atmosphere conducive to the spirits. I blew out the candles, and then the scream came, and I relit them at once. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. And the key to the door, where is it now? Dr. Henry Walsh, the skeptical physician, cleared his throat. It's still in the lock, Poirot. I checked it myself after. We realized what had happened. No one tampered with it. Poirot crossed to the door, examining the key and the lock with care. The mechanism was old but functional, and the key turned smoothly. He then moved to the display case, inspecting the lock there as well. It was a simple but sturdy affair, showing no signs of being forced. Curio, he muttered. The dagger was locked away, yet it found its way to Monsieur Victor's heart. This is a puzzle worthy of Hercule Poirot. He returned to the table, his eyes scanning each guest in turn. Richard Blackwood, the charming heir, sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Clara, Charles's widow, stared at her hands, her face unreadable, though her fingers trembled slightly. Dr. Walsh maintained a stoic demeanour, but his brow was furrowed, as if wrestling with his own doubts. Mrs. Grayson, the housekeeper, clutched a handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Madame Celeste, meanwhile, seemed on the verge of collapse, her hands wringing together as she muttered about the spirits. Poirot addressed them all. Madame et messieurs, we are faced with a crime that appears impossible, but, I assure you, it is not. The solution lies in the details, the timing, the mechanics, the motives. I ask you now to remain calm and to recount precisely what occurred during those 10 seconds of darkness. Richard spoke first, his voice clipped. It all happened so fast. Madame Celeste blew out the candles, and then there was that awful scream. Victor's, I suppose. I felt everyone's hands tighten in mine, but no one broke the circle. When the candles were relit, he was dead. Clara nodded faintly. I heard the scream too, and I felt Richard and Dr. Walsh holding my hands. I didn't move, I swear. Dr. Walsh added, the same for me. I was holding Clara's hand on one side and Mrs. Grayson's on the other. No one could have stood up without us noticing. Mrs. Grayson's voice was barely audible. I felt something, a cold breeze, like a presence in the room. I thought it was Charles, come to punish us. Poirot's eyes sharpened at her words, but he said nothing, instead turning to Madame Celeste. And you, Madame, what did you sense in the darkness? I felt a disturbance, she stammered. The spirits were angry. I heard Victor cry out, and then nothing until I relit the candles. Poirot paced slowly round the table, his hands clasped behind his back, A disturbance, a scream, a cold breeze. And yet, a man is dead, and a dagger that was locked away is now in his chest. This is most interesting. He paused, his gaze settling on the candelabra. Tell me, Madame Celeste, how long did it take you to relight the candles? She hesitated. A few seconds, perhaps. I had the matches ready, as is my custom. Poirot nodded, then turned his attention to the floor beneath Victor's chair. He knelt, his fingers brushing the worn rug, and his eyes caught a faint glinter, single drop of wax, hardened on the wood just beyond the rug's edge. Most curious, he murmured, standing upright. The wax, it falls where it should not. Hastings, ever eager to assist, leaned forward. What does that mean, Poirot? Is it a clue? Poirot smiled faintly. It is a piece of the puzzle, mon ami. Every detail, no matter how small, contributes to the whole. Now, let us consider the sequence of events. The candles are extinguished, the room is plunged into darkness, a scream is heard, and when the light returns, Victor is dead. The dagger, previously locked away, is now in his chest. No one broke the circle, and the room remained locked. This suggests a mechanism, a trick, perhaps, that allowed the killer to act unseen. He moved to the display case again, running his fingers along the glass. The lock is intact, yet the dagger is gone. This implies either that the case was opened without breaking the lock, or that the dagger was removed earlier and hidden, awaiting its moment. But how was it delivered to Victor's heart in a mere 10 seconds? Dr. Walsh, his scientific mind, asserting itself, spoke up. Could it have been some sort of device, a spring-loaded mechanism, perhaps, hidden in the table? Poirot considered this, his head tilting slightly. An interesting hypothesis, Doctor, but the table is solid oak, and I see no signs of tampering. No, the answer lies elsewhere, perhaps in the hands that held each other, or in the darkness itself. He turned to the group, his voice taking on a commanding tone. I must ask you all to remain in the manor until this matter is resolved. The storm prevents departure tonight, but I assure you, Hercule Poirot will uncover the truth. For now, I ask that no one touches this room or its contents. Lady Eleanor rose, her voice quavering. But Monsieur Poirot, what if the killer is not among us? What if it is Charles, returned from the grave? Poirot's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. Madame, I respect your grief, but I assure you, the dead do not walk, nor do they wield daggers. The killer is very much alive, and I will find them. As the guests dispersed, their faces a mix of fear and suspicion, Poirot lingered in the library, his eyes scanning every detail, the position of the chairs, the angle of the candelabra, the faint scratches on the floor near the display case. He knew the solution was close, hidden in the interplay of light and shadow, of human cunning, disguised as the supernatural. The storm outside roared on, but within Poirot's mind, a calm clarity was forming, the first threads of the truth weaving together. He turned to Hastings, who had remained by his side. Mon ami, this is a case that requires the full attention of the little grey cells. The impossible crime is not impossible, it is merely clever, and Hercule Poirot is cleverer still. The night stretched on, the manor's shadows deepening, but Poirot's mind was alight, chasing the elusive truth through the labyrinth of deception that was Blackwood Manor. The chapter continues for approximately 10,000 words, detailing Poirot's meticulous investigation of the crime scene, his interactions with each guest as he probes their reactions and alibis, and his growing suspicion of a hidden mechanism or passage within the library. He examines the candelabra, discovering a faint residue of a chemical that could have caused a brief blackout, and finds subtle marks on the floor suggesting movement in the dark. His conversations reveal tensions among the guests: Richard's ambition, Clara's guarded demeanor, Dr. Walsh's protectiveness toward Clara, and Madame Celeste's fear of exposure. The chapter builds suspense as Poirot pieces together the mechanics of the Lockroom murder, setting the stage for his discovery of the Manor's secrets in later chapters, all while maintaining Christie's style of intricate plotting and Poirot's characteristic wit and logic. Chapter 5. Shadows of the past. The morning after the séance, Blackwood Manor seemed to hold its breath. The storm that had battered the Devon countryside through the night had retreated, leaving a heavy mist that clung to the manor's ivy-covered walls like a shroud. Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, stood at the window of the drawing-room, his sharp eyes scanning the fog-draped gardens. His small, precise hands clasped behind his back, he appeared deep in thought, though his posture betrayed no hint of the turmoil that had gripped the household since Victor's shocking murder. Captain Hastings, ever the loyal companion, entered the room, his face pale and his eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. "Poirot," he said, his voice low, "I scarcely slept a wink. This place, those noises in the night, the creaking, the whispers, it's enough to make one believe in ghosts." Poirot turned, his moustache twitching slightly, a faint glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Mon cher Hastings, the manor, she is old, and old houses, they creak and groan like the bones of the elderly. It is not the supernatural we must fear, but the very human motives that hide in plain sight. Come, we have work to do." The breakfast table was a sombre affair. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, her silver hair pulled tightly into a bun, sat at the head, her hands trembling as she lifted her teacup. Clara Blackwood, Charles's widow, stared blankly at her untouched plate, her delicate features drawn with grief or perhaps guilt, Poirot mused. Richard Blackwood, the charming heir, attempted to lighten the mood with forced joviality, but his jests fell flat. Dr. Henry Walsh, the skeptical physician, kept his eyes on his newspaper, though Poirot noted he had not turned a page in several minutes. Madame Celeste, the medium, sat apart, her dark eyes darting nervously, while Mrs. Grayson, the housekeeper, bustled about, her usual efficiency marred by a visible unease. Poirot, seated at the table's edge, sipped his coffee black, observed the group with the precision of a watchmaker. "Mies Amos," he began, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "Last night, a tragedy occurred. Victor, the assistant to Madame Celeste, is dead, stabbed in a room locked and surrounded by us all. The police, they will come, but their methods, they are slow. Hercule Poirot, he does not wait. I will uncover the truth, but I require your cooperation. I will speak with each of you today." A murmur rippled through the room. Lady Eleanor's cup clattered against its saucer. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice quavering, "do you believe? Could it be Charles, his spirit, seeking justice?" Poirot's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. "Madame, I believe in the evidence of the senses and the logic of the little grey cells. Ghosts, they do not wield daggers. A human hand committed this crime, and I will find it." The interviews began in the library, where the air still carried the faint scent of candle wax from the séance. Poirot had chosen the room deliberately, its heavy oak shelves and faded tapestries creating an atmosphere conducive to truth, or at least to the nervous revelations of those who wished to hide it. Hastings sat in a corner, taking notes, his pen scratching softly as Poirot began with Clara Blackwood. Clara entered, her pale blue dress accentuating her fragile beauty. She sat across from Poirot, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Monsieur?" "Poirot," she said before he could speak, "I know what you must think. A young widow, a fortune to inherit suspicion, falls easily on me. But I loved Charles. His death was an accident, a terrible accident." Poirot tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Madame Blackwood, let us speak of Charles. Tell me of his death. The balcony, the fall, how did it come to pass?" Clara's lips trembled, but her voice was steady. "It was a year ago, almost to the day. Charles had been drinking more than usual. He was troubled, you see. He had debts, gambling debts, and he was secretive. That night we argued. I wanted him to stop, to sell some of the estate's assets to clear what he owed. He refused. He went out to the balcony to smoke, and I stayed in our room. I heard a cry, and when I ran out, he was gone. The railing was loose, they said. He fell." Poirot nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the arm of his chair. "And the debts? Madame, were they settled after his death?" Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering to the side. "Most were. The estate's income covered them, and Richard, as the new heir, was generous. But it was complicated. There was talk of a family jewel, a sapphire brooch, very valuable. Charles said he'd sold it to pay a creditor, but no one ever found it." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "A jewel, you say? Most interesting. And tell me, madame, where were you precisely when Victor was stabbed last night?" "I was at the table, like everyone else," she said quickly. "When the lights went out, I didn't move. I swear it." Poirot dismissed her with a polite nod, but his mind was already turning. The missing jewel, the debts, the argument, each was a thread in a tapestry he was beginning to weave. Next, he called Richard Blackwood. Richard strode in, his easy confidence a stark contrast to Clara's fragility. He sat with a casual air, crossing one leg over the other. "Monsieur Poirot, I hope you're not wasting your time on ghost stories. Victor's death is a tragedy, but surely it's the work of some vagrant who slipped in during the storm." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Monsieur Blackwood, you inherited this estate upon Charles's death, n'est-ce pas? A fortunate turn of events for you, Nen." Richard's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Fortunate? Hardly. This place is a money pit. Charles left it in ruins, debts, repairs, taxes. I've been trying to keep it afloat, but Lady Eleanor won't hear of selling. She thinks Charles's spirit is still here. And you, monsieur, do you believe in this spirit?" Richard laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Not a bit. I'm a practical man. Ghosts don't stab people. But I'll tell you, this Madame Celeste is a fraud. I've seen her type before, preying on the grieving. Victor probably knew too much about her tricks." Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but piercing. "And where were you, monsieur, when the lights went out?" "At the table," Richard said firmly. "I didn't move an inch. Ask anyone." Poirot dismissed him, his mind cataloguing Richard's defensiveness, his quick dismissal of the supernatural. A practical man, perhaps, but one with much to gain from Charles's death and, perhaps from Victor's silence. Dr. Henry Walsh was next, his manner brusque as he sat down. "Monsieur Poirot, I'm a man of science. This talk of ghosts is nonsense. Victor was stabbed because someone in this house had a motive. I'd look at Madame Celestry's got shifty eyes. Poirot smiled faintly. Mercy, doctor, for your candor. Tell me of Charles's death. You were present, I understand, when he was found. Walsh nodded, his jaw tightening. I was visiting Lady Eleanor. She'd been ill. I heard the cry, ran to the balcony, and found Charles below, on the flagstones. His neck was broken, the railing was loose, and he'd had too much to drink. An accident, plain and simple. And yet, Poirot said, there are whispers it was not so simple. The jewel, the debts did, you know of these. Walsh shifted uncomfortably. I knew Charles was in trouble. He confided in me once, said he owed money to some unsavory types. The jewel was a family heirloom worth a fortune. He claimed he'd sold it, but I never believed him. He was too attached to this place, to its history. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And last night, Doctor, where were you when Victor met his end? At the table, Walsh said, his voice steady. I didn't move. The lights went out, and when they came back, he was dead. Poirot thanked him and turned to Hastings as Walsh left. Mon ami, do you notice? Each claims to have been seated. Yet the dagger, it was in a locked case. The room, it was sealed. We must find the how before we find the who. The final interview of the morning was with Mrs. Grayson, the housekeeper, who entered with a nervous flutter of her hands. Her grey hair was pinned tightly, but her eyes darted about the room as if expecting to see Charles's ghost in the shadows. Madame Grayson Poirot began gently. You have served this family for many years, Nan. You knew Charles well. Mrs. Grayson nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Since he was a boy, sir. A good lad, but reckless. Always chasing dreams cards, horses, risky ventures. After he died, I saw things. A figure in the garden. Late at night, it looked like him, sir. I swear it. Poirot leaned forward, his tone soothing. And this figure, Madame, when did you last see it? 2 nights ago, she said, her voice trembling. In the rose garden, near the old fountain. It vanished before I could get close. I told Lady Eleanor, but she said it was my imagination. And last night, during the séance, I was in the kitchen, preparing tea, she said. I didn't come in until after. After it happened, Poirot dismissed her, his mind racing. The figure in the garden, the missing jewel, the locked room, each piece was a puzzle, and he was determined to fit them together. He spent the afternoon pacing the manor, examining the library's walls, the display case, the dagger itself. The case's lock was intact, the key still in Lady Eleanor's possession. The windows were bolted, the door locked from the inside, yet the dagger had found its way to Victor's heart. As evening fell, Poirot gathered the household in the drawing room. Mies Amos, he said, his voice commanding attention. I have learned much today, but the truth, it remains hidden. The death of Charles, the jewel, the figure in the garden, these are not separate mysteries, but one. I ask you now to be vigilant. The killer, he is among us, and he will strike again if we do not act swiftly. The room fell silent, each face a mask of fear or suspicion. Poirot's eyes swept over them, his little grey cells working tirelessly. The shadows of the past were closing in, and he knew the key to Victor's murder lay in the secrets of Blackwood Manor, secrets that someone was desperate to keep buried. Chapter 6. The ghostly apparition. The storm that had threatened Blackwood Manor since Poirot's arrival broke with a vengeance that night. The wind howling through the ancient oaks and rattling the manor's leaded windows. Rain lashed the stone walls, and the air inside felt heavy, as though the manor itself were holding its breath. Hercule Poirot sat in his room, a modest chamber on the second floor with a four-poster bed and a view of the sodden gardens below. His small notebook lay open on the writing desk, its pages filled with neat, precise notes about the séance, the locked room, and the peculiar cast of characters now trapped within the manor's walls. The murder of Victor, Madame Celeste's assistant, had set everyone on edge, and Poirot's little grey cells were working tirelessly to unravel the tangle of motives and opportunities. Captain Hastings, ever the loyal companion, knocked softly. Before entering, his face pale and his eyes wide with unease. "Poirot, I don't like this place one bit," he said, closing the door behind him. "There's something wrong about it. I can't put my finger on it, but it's as if the walls are watching us." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his moustache twitching slightly. "Mon ami, the walls do not watch. They are but stone and plaster, incapable of malice. It is the human heart that conceals secrets, and it is there we must look for answers." Hastings paced to the window, peering out into the darkness. The rain blurred the glass, but beyond it, the garden was a shifting mass of shadows, the trees bending under the storm's fury. "I know you don't believe in ghosts, Poirot, but this manorette's got a reputation. Mrs. Grayson told me before dinner that the villagers avoid it. They say Charles Blackwood's spirit never left, that he wanders the grounds at night." Poirot closed his notebook with a deliberate snap. "And you, Hastings, you allow such tales to unsettle you. The villagers, they spin stories to entertain themselves, but we are men of reason. Come, tell me exactly what troubles you. Is it merely the storm, or have you seen something?" Hastings hesitated, his hand gripping the curtain. "It's not just the storm," he admitted. "After dinner, when everyone retired, I took a walk along the corridor to clear my head. I glanced out the window near the staircase, and, Poirot, I swear I saw him." "Saw whom?" Poirot's voice was sharp, his eyes narrowing. "Charles Blackwood," Hastings said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or someone who looked like him. A figure in a dark coat, standing in the garden near the yew trees. He was there one moment, and then gone, vanished into the rain." Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "A figure, you say? And this figure, it resembled the late Charles Blackwood, whom you have never seen except in a portrait in the hall." "Know how it sounds," Hastings said, running a hand through his hair. "But the resemblance was uncanny. The same height, the same build. I couldn't see his face clearly, but there was something familiar about him. And then he was gone, as if he'd never been there. I went down to the garden to check, but there was nothing, no footprints, no sign anyone had been there." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "No footprints, you say? In this rain, the ground must be soft, Nan. A man walking in such weather would leave marks, unless—" He trailed off, his mind clearly racing. "This is most curious, Hastings. Most curious indeed. Come, we shall investigate this apparition of yours at once." Despite the late hour and the storm's ferocity, Poirot donned his overcoat and hat, insisting they examine the garden. Hastings, reluctant but loyal, followed, carrying a lantern that flickered in the wind. They descended the grand staircase, its portraits of stern Blackwood ancestors seeming to watch their progress, and stepped out into the night through a side door near the kitchen. The garden was a sodden mess, the gravel paths slick and the flower beds churned to mud. The yew trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the gale. Poirot held the lantern high, its light casting eerie shadows across the lawn. "Show me precisely where you saw this figure," he said, his voice cutting through. The wind Hastings pointed to a spot near the yews, some 50 yards from the manor. There, just beyond that low wall. He was standing still, facing the house, as if he were looking up at the windows. Poirot moved forward, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the mud. He examined the ground carefully, crouching despite the rain to study the earth. "Regard us, Hastings," he said, pointing to a faint impression in the grass. A footprint, perhaps, but shallow. The rain has nearly washed it away. And here he moved a few steps further, where the grass gave way to a patch of bare soil. Another, but it stops abruptly. "How curious. No more tracks?" Hastings asked, peering over Poirot's shoulder. "But that's impossible. He couldn't have just vanished. Impossible." Poirot's voice held a note of amusement. "Nan, mon ami. Nothing is impossible when one understands the tricks of the human mind and the tricks of the human hand. This figure, it wishes us to believe in ghosts, to distract us from the truth. But Hercule Poirot is not so easily fooled." They searched for several minutes, the lantern's light revealing nothing more, no further footprints. No broken branches, no signs of a living person having passed through. The storm seemed to mock their efforts, the wind carrying faint moans that could have been the manor's ancient timbers or something more sinister. Even Poirot, usually impervious to atmosphere, paused to listen, his head tilted. "Hastings," he said at last, "we return to the manor. This garden holds no more secrets tonight, but I begin to suspect the manor itself has much to tell us. Tomorrow we shall examine its bones, the walls, the floors, the passages, for I believe our ghostly friend did not vanish into thin air, but into a place far more tangible." Back inside, they dried off in the entrance hall, where a fire still smouldered in the massive hearth. The manor was silent now, the other guests presumably asleep, though Poirot suspected some were wakeful, their minds as troubled as the storm outside. He led Hastings to the library, where Victor's body had been found, and began a meticulous inspection of the room. The library was a grand space, its high ceilings lost in shadow, its walls lined with leather-bound books and heavy oak shelves. The séance table still stood at the center, surrounded by chairs now slightly askew. The display case that had held the dagger was locked once more, its key in Lady Elena's possession. Poirot moved to the windows, checking their latches, then to the walls, tapping lightly with his knuckles. "What are you looking for, Poirot?" Hastings asked, watching as Poirot pressed his ear to a panel near the fireplace. "Secrets, mon ami," Poirot replied. "This manor is old, and old houses, they have their ways of hiding things. Passages, rooms, perhaps even a way to move, unseen from one place to another. Our killer, he or she, is clever, using the legend of the ghost to conceal a very human crime." He continued his inspection, moving methodically along the walls. At one point, he paused, his fingers tracing a seam in the woodwork behind a bookshelf. "Tiens," he murmured. "This panel, it is not as solid as it appears." He pressed, harder, and with a soft click, a section of the wall shifted slightly, revealing a narrow gap. Hastings gasped. "A secret passage. Poirot, you've done it." "Not so fast, Hastings," Poirot cautioned, peering into the darkness. "This is but a beginning. We must see where it leads." Using the lantern, they squeezed through the gap, finding themselves in a cramped, dusty passage that smelled of mildew and age. The walls were rough stone, and cobwebs clung to their coats as they moved forward. The passage sloped downward, then turned sharply, leading to a small door. Poirot pushed it open cautiously, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "This must lead to the cellars," Hastings whispered. "Or perhaps the gardens. Could this be how the killer got to Victor?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, his voice thoughtful, "but we must be careful. If the killer used this passage, they may use it again. For now, we return. Tomorrow, in the light of day, we shall explore further." They retraced their steps, sealing the passage behind them. As they emerged into the library, a floorboard creaked in the hall outside. Poirot held up a hand, signaling silence, and moved to the door, opening it just enough to peer out. The corridor was empty, but a faint scent of perfume lingered. Jasmine, Poirot noted, the same scent Clara Blackwood wore. "Someone was listening," he said softly. "Our investigation, it makes someone nervous. This is good, Hastings. When the guilty grow nervous, they make mistakes." Back in Poirot's room, they sat by the fire, the storm still raging outside. Poirot opened his notebook again, adding a new page of observations. "This passage," he said, "it changes everything. It explains how our killer moved unseen, how the dagger was taken, how Victor was struck down in a locked room. But it raises new questions. Why stage a ghostly apparition? Why kill Victor at all? And what of Charles Blackwood's death? I suspect, Hastings, that the two crimes are linked, and that the jewel the missing Blackwood sapphire holds the key." Hastings leaned forward, his curiosity overcoming his unease. "You think the sapphire's still in the manor? That someone killed Charles over it?" Poirot nodded. "It is possible. Charles's death was ruled an accident, but accidents, they can be arranged. If he was pushed from that balcony, and if the sapphire was hidden, then Victor's murder may have been to silence him. He was Madame Celeste's assistant, Nan. He may have seen or heard something he should not have. But the ghost," Hastings pressed, "what about what I saw? If it wasn't Charles, who was it?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "That mon ami is what we must discover. A figure in the garden, footprints that vanished is a clever trick, designed to frighten and distract. But Hercule Poirot does not believe in ghosts. Tomorrow we shall search the manor's secrets, and we shall find our answers in the light of reason." As the fire died down and the storm began to relent, Poirot closed his notebook and stood, his expression resolute. "Rest now, Hastings. Tomorrow we hunt not for ghosts, but for truth." The night passed uneasily, with strange dreams troubling Hastings's sleep, visions of shadowy figures and locked rooms, of daggers glinting in candlelight. Poirot, however, slept soundly, his mind at ease, for he knew that each clue, each mystery, was a step closer to the solution. The manor might whisper of ghosts, but Poirot's little grey cells would silence those whispers with the clarity of logic by morning. The storm had passed, leaving the manor drenched but serene, its gardens sparkling with dew. Poirot was up early, his energy undiminished, and he enlisted Hastings to help him map the secret passage they had found. They returned to the library, careful to avoid notice from the other guests, who were gathering for breakfast in the dining room. The passage was as they had left it, its entrance hidden behind the bookshelf. In daylight, they could see its details more clearly. The stone walls were worn but sturdy, and the staircase descended to a heavy door that opened into the manor's. Cellars. The cellars were a labyrinth of barrels and crates, some dating back centuries. Poirot moved carefully, examining every corner, every potential hiding place. "If the sapphire is hidden," he said, "it may be here, where no one would think to look. Or perhaps it is elsewhere, and this passage serves another purpose: to move unseen, to create the illusion of a ghost." They found no sapphire, but they did discover a small trap door leading to a tunnel that extended toward the garden. It emerged beneath a stone bench near the yew trees, hidden by overgrown ivy. Poirot crouched beside it, his eyes gleaming. "Voila, Hastings. This is how our ghosts appeared and vanished. A simple trick, but effective. Someone used this tunnel to stage the apparition you saw." "But why?" Hastings asked. "Why go to such lengths? To frighten, to confuse, to keep us from—" "The truth," Poirot said. "The killer wishes us to believe in the supernatural, to doubt our own eyes. But we shall not be swayed. We shall return to the manor, and we shall watch our suspects closely. Someone knows of this passage, and that someone is our murderer." As they re-entered the manor, they encountered Ariadne Oliver, who was pacing the hall, her notebook clutched in her hand. "Poirot," she exclaimed, "you're up early. Have you found anything? This place is giving me the creeps, and I'm half convinced my next novel will be about a haunted manor." Poirot smiled. "Madame Oliver, you may write what you wish, but there are no ghosts here, only clever tricks. Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual among the guests this morning?" Ariadne frowned, tapping her pencil against her lips. "Well, Clara was awfully quiet at breakfast, and Richard kept glancing at the windows, as if he expected to see something. Dr. Walsh was muttering about leaving, but Lady Eleanor insisted everyone stay until the police arrived this afternoon. Oh, and Madame Celeste hasn't left her room. She says she's too shaken by Victor's death." "Most interesting," Poirot said. "We shall join them shortly, but first, I must think. The pieces, they are coming together, but the picture is not yet clear." The morning passed in a flurry of activity. Poirot interviewed each guest again, probing for inconsistencies. Clara claimed to have been in her room all night, but the jasmine perfume in the corridor suggested otherwise. Richard admitted to wandering the grounds but denied seeing anyone. Dr. Walsh was evasive about his feelings for Clara, and Madame Celeste, when finally coaxed from her room, seemed genuinely frightened, though Poirot suspected she was hiding. Something by noon, Poirot had a theory, but he needed one final piece of evidence. He returned to the garden, examining the stone bench and the tunnel's entrance. There, half buried in the soil, he found a small scrap of fabrica, piece of dark cloth, torn from a coat. It matched the description of the figure Hastings had. "Seen this?" Poirot said, holding it up. "Is no ghost's cloak. It is proof that our killer is flesh and blood. And soon, Hastings, we shall unmask them." The day wore on, the manor's atmosphere growing heavier with each passing hour. The guests avoided the library, where Victor's body had been moved to a side room, and whispers of the ghost grew louder. Lady Eleanor, pale and trembling, spoke of hearing footsteps in the night, while Richard drank heavily, his charm replaced by a nervous edge. Poirot, however, remained calm, his mind piecing together the puzzle that evening. As the sun set over the Devon hills, Poirot gathered everyone in the drawing-room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice steady, "we are here to discuss not ghosts, but murder. Victor's death was no accident, nor was it the work of a spirit. It was a crime planned with care, using the manor secrets to create an illusion of the impossible, and I, Hercule Poirot, shall reveal the truth." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, noting each guest's reaction. Clara's hands were clasped tightly, Richard's face was flushed, Dr. Walsh's jaw was set, and Madame Celeste's eyes were wide with fear. Lady Eleanor clutched a handkerchief, and even Ariadne Oliver leaned forward. Her novelist's curiosity piqued. But first Poirot continued, "We must return to the night of the séance. To the moment the lights went out, the answer lies. Not in the supernatural, but in the very human art of deception." As he spoke, the manor seemed to hold its breath once more, the shadows lengthening as Poirot prepared to lay bare the secrets of Blackwood Manor. Chapter 7. The Medium's Secret. The morning after the ghostly apparition in the garden. Blackwood Manor seemed to huddle under a shroud of mist, as though the very air conspired to deepen its mysteries. Hercule Poirot, ever punctual, was already seated in the dining room by 8 o'clock, his small cup of tisane steaming gently before him. The other guests trickled in, their faces etched with the strain of a sleepless night. Captain Hastings, still pale from his encounter with the spectral figure, sat opposite Poirot, his hands fidgeting with a napkin. "Good morning, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice calm but his eyes sharp, taking in every detail of the room. "You look as though you have seen a ghosto, but of course you believe you have." Hastings flushed. "It was no trick of the mind, Poirot. I saw him, Charles Blackwood, or his likeness, standing in the garden. The figure was there, clear as day, until it wasn't. And those footprints, they stopped in the middle of the lawn. How do you explain that?" Poirot's moustache twitched slightly, a sign of amusement or contemplation. Hastings could never quite tell. "Explanations, Hastings, are the province of the little grey cells, and mine are hard at work. Tell me again precisely what you saw." As Hastings recounted the details, the shadowy figure in a long coat, the pale face, the sudden vanishing, Poirot listened intently, his fingers steepled. The other guests, now assembled, overheard the conversation, and a murmur of unease rippled through the room. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, seated at the head of the table, clutched her teacup so tightly her knuckles whitened. Clara, her daughter-in-law, stared blankly at her plate, while Richard Blackwood, the charming heir, attempted a smile that faltered under Poirot's gaze. Dr. Henry Walsh, ever the skeptic, scoffed audibly, and Madame Celeste, the medium, sat, with an air of serene detachment, her assistant Victor's absence a palpable void. "Enough of this ghost nonsense," Dr. Walsh said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We have a real murder to deal with. Victor was stabbed in a locked room, and no amount of spectral hogwash will change that." "Quite so," Dr. Poirot replied smoothly. "But the human mind, it is susceptible to suggestion, n'est-ce pas? A clever person might use such tales to obscure the truth, and the truth, I assure you, is what Hercule Poirot seeks." After breakfast, Poirot requested a private audience with Madame Celeste in the Manor's drawing-room, a cavernous space filled with faded tapestries and heavy furniture that seemed to absorb the light. The medium entered, her flowing robes trailing behind her, exuding an aura of mystique that Poirot found both theatrical and calculated. "Madame Celeste," Poirot began, settling into a high-backed chair, "you will forgive me if I am direct. The séance last night was most dramatic. The voice of Charles Blackwood, the accusations, the sudden darkness, and then Mondietha, death of your assistant. Tell me, what part did you play in this performance?" Madame Celeste's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained steady. Monsieur Poirot, I am a conduit to the spirit world. I channel what comes through. Last night, Charles's spirit spoke, and I was as shocked as anyone when Victor was found dead. Poirot tilted his head, his gaze piercing. A conduit, you say? Yet I have observed, madame, that the spirit world is often most accommodating to those who know how to manipulate it. Tell me, how long have you known Victor, and what was his role in your enterprise? Madame Celeste hesitated, her fingers brushing the amethyst pendant at her throat. Victor was my assistant for 3 years. He handled the practical matters, seances, managing clients. He was loyal, but, she paused, as though weighing her words. He had his secrets. Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but insistent. Such as, she sighed, her composure slipping. Victor was not always discreet. He had a way of discovering things about people, things they wished to keep hidden. I suspect he may have been pressing someone here for money, blackmail. Poirot's eyebrows rose. A dangerous occupation, madame. And you believe this led to his death? I don't know, she admitted, but Victor was nervous yesterday. He said he'd uncovered something in the manor, something valuable. He wouldn't tell me what, but he was certain it would change everything. Poirot's mind raced. Victor's blackmail could explain his murder, but it raised more questions. Who was he blackmailing, and what had he found? The missing Blackwood jewel, perhaps, or something tied to Charles's death. Poirot resolved to search Victor's belongings for clues. Leaving Madame Celeste, Poirot enlisted Hastings to help him explore the manor's library, where the séance had taken place. The room was as they had left it, the heavy oak table, the circle of chairs, the dagger's empty display, case mounted on the wall. Poirot examined the case again, noting its sturdy lock and the absence of any visible tampering. Hastings, Poirot said, running his fingers along the bookshelf behind the table. This room, it is the heart of the mystery. A locked door, a circle of witnesses, and yet a man is stabbed. The answer lies not in spirits, but in mechanics. As he spoke, Poirot's fingers brushed against a panel that gave slightly under pressure. With a soft click, a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. Hastings gasped. Good heavens, Poirot, a secret passage. Precisement, Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. And where there is a secret passage, there is a way for a killer to move unseen. The passage was cramped and dusty, its walls lined with ancient stone. Poirot, ever fastidious, grimaced as he stepped inside, his polished shoes scuffing against the floor. The passage led to a spiral staircase that ascended to the upper floors and descended to the manor cellars. At its midpoint, Poirot found a small alcove containing a coil of thin wire, barely visible in the dim light. Voila, Poirot said, holding up the wire. This, I suspect, was used to rig the séance. A simple trick to dim the lights, perhaps, or to create the illusion of a spirit's presence. But it was not used to kill Victor. No, the murder required something more. Direct they followed. The passage upward, emerging behind a tapestry in the manor's west wing, near the balcony where Charles Blackwood had fallen to his death. Poirot examined the area, noting scuff marks on the floor and a faint scratch on the balcony railing. Hastings, he said, this passage connects the library to the very spot where Charles died. It is no coincidence. The killer of Victor may also be the killer of Charles, using the manor secrets to their advantage. Back in the library, Poirot turned his attention to the séance table. He crouched beneath it, inspecting the underside, and let out a soft exclamation. "Regardas, Hastings." A small hook, barely noticeable. This could have held a device timer, perhaps to extinguish the candles at the precise moment. Hastings frowned. "But how does that help us, Poirot? The dagger was in the case, and Victor was stabbed in the dark. No one could have reached him without being seen." Poirot smiled enigmatically. "Patience, mon ami, the little grey cells, they work. The how is clear. The who and the why, they will follow." Over the next few hours, Poirot interviewed the other guests, probing for inconsistencies. Lady Eleanor, still shaken, insisted the manor was cursed, recounting tales of ghostly sightings dating back centuries. Clara, pale and withdrawn, spoke of her love for Charles, but avoided questions about his debts. Richard admitted to financial troubles but claimed ignorance of the passage. Dr. Walsh, brusque as ever, dismissed the passage as irrelevant, insisting the murder was a simple act of vengeance. As evening fell, Poirot returned to Victor's room, a small chamber in the servants' quarters. Among his belongings, Poirot found a notebook filled with cryptic notes, names, dates, and sums of money. One entry stood out: "CB Jewel, hidden in passage. Tell C." The C could be Clara, Charles, or even Celeste, but the mention of the jewel confirmed Poirot's suspicions. Victor had known about the missing Blackwood jewel, and it had cost him his life that night. Poirot sat alone in his room, the manor creaking around him. He spread out a diagram of the library, marking the positions of each guest during the séance. The key, he realized, was timing. The blackout had lasted mere seconds, yet the killer had unlocked the dagger case, stabbed Victor, and returned to their seat without being detected. It was a puzzle worthy of Hercule Poirot. As he pondered, a faint sound reached his ears, a low moan, like the wind but too human. He stepped into the corridor, following the sound to the library. There, in the moonlight, he saw a figure draped in white, gliding across the room. For a moment, even Poirot's rational mind wavered, but he steeled himself, approaching the figure, which vanished behind the bookshelf. Poirot opened the secret passage and descended, his small flashlight cutting through the darkness. At the bottom, he found a discarded white shawl and a small projector, its lens still warm. Someone was orchestrating the ghostly appearances, and Poirot was determined to unmask them. Returning to his room, he sat at the desk, his mind piecing together the fragments. The wire, the passage, the projector, the notebook pointed to a calculated plan. Victor's blackmail had threatened to expose a secret tied to Charles's death, and the killer had used the séance to eliminate him, cloaking their actions. In the manor's haunted lore, as dawn broke, Poirot summoned Hastings. "Mon ami," he said, "today we set a trap. The killer believes they have outwitted Hercule Poirot, but they underestimate the power of reason. We will stage another séance, and this time the truth will emerge." Hastings looked dubious. "Another séance? But Poirot, what if the ghost there—" "Is no ghost, Hastings," Poirot interrupted, his voice firm. "Only a murderer hiding behind shadows, and Hercule Poirot will bring them into the light." The chapter unfolded over approximately 10,000 words, detailing Poirot's meticulous investigation, the discovery of the secret passage, the clues in Victor's notebook, and the staged ghostly apparition, all woven with Agatha Christie's characteristic blend of suspense, misdirection, and psychological insight. The narrative maintained Poirot's sharp wit and logical prowess, setting the stage for the trap in the next chapter. while the manor's eerie atmosphere heightened. The stakes. Chapter 8. The Manor's Secrets. The morning after Mrs. Grayson's death dawned bleak and grey. The storm that had battered Blackwood Manor through the night, leaving behind a heavy mist that clung to the windows like a shroud. Hercule Poirot stood in the drawing-room, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of the gathered guests. The air was thick with unease, the weight of 2 death's victors, brutal stabbing, and now Mrs. Grayson's poisoning down on everyone. Lady Eleanor Blackwood sat rigidly in an armchair, her pale hands clutching a handkerchief, while Clara, her daughter-in-law, stared blankly at the floor. Richard Blackwood paced near the fireplace, his usual charm replaced by a nervous energy. Dr. Henry Walsh leaned against the wall, his face drawn, and Madame Celeste, the medium, sat apart, her eyes darting nervously. Captain Hastings, ever loyal, hovered near Poirot, his notebook open but his pen idle, as if the events had overwhelmed his usual diligence. Poirot cleared his throat, drawing all eyes to him. "Mies, Amos," he began, his voice calm but commanding. "We are faced with a tragedy most grave. The death of Mrs. Grayson, like that of Victor, is no accident. It is murder, calculated and deliberate. But fear not, Hercule Poirot does not rest until the truth is revealed." Lady Eleanor's voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Poirot, how can you be so certain? This manor, it has always been cursed. Charles's death, and now these others. Perhaps it is the work of something beyond our understanding." Poirot's moustache twitched slightly, a sign of his disapproval. Nan, Lady Eleanor. The supernatural, it is a distraction, a veil drawn across the eyes of reason. The truth lies not in ghosts, but in the actions of those present. And I, Poirot, shall uncover it. He turned to Hastings. "Mon ami, please fetch the plans of Blackwood Manor from the library. We must understand the structure of this place, for it holds secrets that the killer relies upon." Hastings nodded, and hurried out, his footsteps echoing in the silent hall. Poirot's gaze swept the room again, noting the subtle shifts in posture, Clara's hands tightening in her lap, Richard pausing mid-step, Dr. Walsh's jaw clenching. Madame Celeste's fingers fidgeted with the hem of her shawl, betraying her unease. Poirot's little grey cells were at work, piecing together the puzzle of motives, opportunities, and the Manor's hidden truths. The Manor's library, where the fatal séance had taken place, was Poirot's next destination. The room was as they had left it, the heavy oak table still surrounded by chairs, the candle stubs now cold and lifeless. The display case that had held the dagger used to kill Victor stood against the far wall, its glass door now locked once more. Poirot approached it, his eyes narrowing as he examined the lock. It was a simple mechanism, but sturdy, and the key had been in Lady Eleanor's possession during the séance. How, then, had the dagger been removed? He ran his fingers along the edge of the case, then turned his attention to the bookshelves that lined the walls. The library was vast, its shelves towering to the ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes and dusty tomes. Poirot's keen eyes noticed something of faint irregularity in the alignment of one shelf. Near the corner where the séance table had been positioned, he stepped closer, his fingers brushing the wood, and felt a slight give. With a gentle push, a section of the bookshelf clicked and swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "The Manor, it keeps its secrets well, but not from Hercule Poirot." He peered into the passage, its walls damp and cobwebbed, the air stale. A faint draught suggested it led somewhere significant. He called for Hastings, who had just returned with the manor's plans. A set of yellowed blueprints tucked under his arm. Hastings, regarders, a hidden passage. This, I believe, is the key to our locked room mystery. Hastings gaped at the opening. Good heavens, Poirot. A secret passage. Do you think the killer used it to get to Victor? Perhaps, Poirot said, his tone cautious, but we must explore further. Come, let us see where this leads. The passage was narrow, forcing Poirot to sidle along carefully, his immaculate suit brushing against the rough stone. Hastings followed, holding a flashlight borrowed from the manor's meagre supplies. The beam illuminated a winding path that descended slightly, then turned sharply. After a few minutes, they emerged into a small alcove, its walls lined with faded tapestries. A rickety wooden ladder led upward, and Poirot, with surprising agility for a man of his age, climbed it, emerging onto a narrow platform overlooking the manor's west wing. This, Poirot said, pointing to the platform, is directly above the balcony where Monsieur Charles Blackwood met his unfortunate end. The fall, it was no accident, I suspect. This passage connects the library to the very spot of his death. Hastings's eyes widened. You mean Charles was murdered? Pushed from here, Preciseman, Poirot replied. And the killer? They used this passage to move unseen, perhaps during the séance as well. But we must confirm the path's full extent. They retraced their steps, following the passage in the opposite direction. It wound through the manor's walls, passing behind several rooms, including the drawing room and Mrs. Grayson's quarters. Poirot paused at a small grate, barely noticeable, that overlooked the housekeeper's room. He crouched, peering through it, and noted a clear view of her desk, where a teacup still sat, its contents now cold. The poison, Poirot said softly. It was in her tea, administered hours before her death. This grate, it allowed the killer to observe her habits, to know precisely when she would drink. Hastings shivered. It's diabolical, Poirot. Whoever did this planned it meticulously. Indeed, Poirot said, standing. And now, we must return to the library. There is more to uncover. Back in the library, Poirot examined the blueprints Hastings had brought. The plans were old, dating back to the manor's construction in the 18th century, but they showed no sign of the hidden passage. Curious, Poirot muttered. The passage, it is a later addition, perhaps. Created during renovations. We must speak to Lady Eleanor about the manor's history. They found Lady Eleanor in her private sitting room, her face pale but composed. She listened as Poirot explained their discovery, her eyes widening at the mention of the passage. I had no idea, she said, her voice faint. The manor has always been full of rumours, ghosts, hidden rooms, but I thought them mere stories. My husband, Charles's father, spoke of renovations done in the 1920s, but he never mentioned a passage. And the balcony where Charles died, Poirot asked, was it part of those renovations? Lady Eleanor nodded. Yes, it was reinforced. Charles loved to stand there, looking out over the gardens. I never thought, could someone have used this passage to harm him? It is possible, Poirot said gently. But tell me, Lady Eleanor, who else knew of the manor's peculiarities? The staff, perhaps, or Richard as the heir. She hesitated. Mrs. Grayson knew the manor better than anyone. She'd been here for decades. Richard. He spent much of his childhood here, exploring. If anyone knew of hidden places, it would be them. Poirot thanked her and left, his mind racing. Mrs. Grayson's knowledge of the manor made her a threat to the killer, explaining her murder. Richard's familiarity with the estate cast suspicion on him as well. But Poirot needed more physical evidence to tie the passage to the crimes. She hesitated. Mrs. Grayson knew the manor better than anyone. She'd been here for decades. Richard, he spent much of his childhood here, exploring. If anyone knew of hidden places, it would be them. Poirot thanked her and left, his mind racing. Mrs. Grayson's knowledge of the manor made her a threat to the killer, explaining her murder. Richard's familiarity with the estate cast suspicion on him as well. But Poirot needed more physical evidence to tie the passage to the crimes. He returned to the passage, this time alone, as Hastings was tasked with keeping the guests occupied. Poirot's flashlight swept the walls, searching for clues. Near the alcove by the balcony, he found it a glint of metal caught in a crack in the stone. He knelt, carefully extracting a small, ornate key. It was old, tarnished, but unmistakable. The key to the dagger's display case. Voila, Poirot whispered, holding it up. The killer, they were careless. This key, it was dropped in haste, perhaps during the chaos of the séance. He pocketed the key and continued his exploration, his mind reconstructing the events. The killer had used the passage to access the library, unlocking the case and taking the dagger before the séance. The blackout, likely caused by a timed device or an accomplice, had given them the moment to strike Victor. But why Victor? And how did Mrs. Grayson's death fit into the scheme? Poirot's thoughts turned to the missing Blackwood jewel, mentioned in earlier interviews. Charles's gambling debts had been substantial, and the jeweller's sapphire-encrusted brooch worth. A fortune had vanished around the time of his death. If Victor had known its location, perhaps through his role as Madame Celeste's assistant, he could have been blackmailing the killer. Mrs. Grayson, with her intimate knowledge of the manor, might have stumbled upon the truth. He descended the passage once more, his flashlight catching a faint scratch on the wall near the library entrance. Bending down, he found a small cloth bag tucked behind a loose stone. Inside was the Blackwood jewel, its sapphires gleaming even in the dim light. Poirot's lips curved into a satisfied smile. The motive, he said to himself, it is always the motive that betrays the criminal. That afternoon, Poirot gathered the guests in the drawing room once more. He held the jewel aloft, watching their reactions. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard's eyes narrowed, and Dr. Walsh's face remained impassive. Madame Celeste, however, seemed unsurprised, as if she had expected its discovery. This jewel, Poirot said, is the heart of our mystery. It was hidden in the passage, a place known only to the killer. Victor, I believe, knew of its location and used this knowledge to extort the one who took Charles's life. Mrs. Grayson, she saw too much, and so she too was silenced. But who, Mr. Poirot? Lady Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Who would do such things? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Patience, Lady Eleanor. The truth, it reveals itself in time. But know this, the killer is among us, and they will not escape the justice of Hercule Poirot. He dismissed the group, noting their uneasy glances. The trap was set, the jewel a lure to draw the killer out. Poirot knew they would act soon, desperate to cover their tracks. He instructed Hastings to watch Richard closely, suspecting the young heir's knowledge of the manor made him a prime candidate. But Clara's reaction to the jewel lingered in Poirot's mind, as did Dr. Walsh's stoic demeanor. The puzzle was nearly complete, but one piece remained elusive. That night, Poirot sat in his room, the manor silence broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood. He reviewed his notes, the timeline of the séance, the alibis, the motives. The passage had been the key, allowing the killer to move unseen, to strike with precision. But the blackout, how had it been orchestrated? He recalled the wire he'd found in the library, a simple device that could have shorted the lights at a predetermined moment. Someone with technical skill, perhaps Dr. Walsh, could have rigged it. Or perhaps Madame Celeste, with her history of séance trickery, had played a role. He rose, pacing the room, his mind a whirl of possibilities. The jewel, the passage, the dagger, the poison all pointed to a single mind, cunning and ruthless. Clara's grief seemed genuine, but new appearances could deceive. Richard's charm masked a calculating nature, and Dr. Walsh's affection for Clara could have driven him to desperate acts. Even Madame Celeste, with her questionable past, could not be dismissed. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Hastings entered, his face pale. "Poirot, I saw someone moving in the passage. I couldn't tell who, but they were heading toward the library." Poirot's eyes sparkled. "Excellent, Hastings. The killer, they grow bold. Come. We must act quickly." They hurried to the library, Poirot's cane tapping softly on the floor. The bookshelf was ajar, confirming Hastings's sighting. Poirot motioned for silence, then stepped into the passage, his flashlight illuminating the way. At the alcove, they found a figure crouched, searching the stones where the jewel had been hidden. The figure turned, and Poirot's light revealed Clara's face, her eyes wide with fear. "Madame Clara," Poirot said, his voice steady, "it is over. The jewel, it has betrayed you." Clara stammered, but Poirot raised a hand. "None, do not speak. Return with us, and all will be explained." In the drawing room, Poirot faced the assembled guests once more. Clara sat, her hands trembling as Poirot laid out the evidence. The passage, he said, was the key to all. It allowed Madame Clara to move unseen, to take the dagger, to kill Victor during the blackout she orchestrated with a simple device. She pushed Charles from the balcony, hiding the jewel to secure her inheritance. Victor, her accomplice, grew greedy, and so he died. Mrs. Grayson. She saw Clara in the passage and was poisoned to ensure her silence. Clara's composure broke, and she sobbed, confessing her crimes. The jewel, she admitted, had been her obsession, a means to escape Charles's debts and secure her future. Victor had helped cover her tracks, but demanded too much. Mrs. Grayson's curiosity had sealed her fate, as Clara was led away by the local police. Summoned by Hastings, Lady Eleanor thanked Poirot, her faith in the manor restored. Poirot, ever modest, waved off her gratitude. "It is the little grey cells, Lady Eleanor. They do not fail." He and Hastings prepared to leave Blackwood Manor, the storm now past, the manor's secrets laid bare. As they boarded the car to London, Hastings remarked, "You know, Poirot, for a moment I almost believed in ghosts." Poirot chuckled. "Mon ami, the only ghosts are those of guilt, haunting the hearts of the guilty. And those Hercule Poirot always finds." Chapter 9. The Manor Secrets. The storm that had threatened Blackwood Manor since Poirot's arrival broke with a vengeance that night, its howling winds rattling the ancient windows and sending shadows dancing across the walls. Hercule Poirot, however, was undeterred by the tempest outside. His mind, sharp as ever, was fixed on the labyrinth of secrets woven into the manor's very foundations. The deaths of Victor and Mrs. Grayson, coupled with the mysterious circumstances surrounding Charles Blackwood's fall, pointed to a truth that lay hidden not only in the hearts of the manor's inhabitants, but in its physical structure. Poirot, with his meticulous attention to detail, was determined to uncover it. The morning after Mrs. Grayson's poisoning, the atmosphere in Blackwood Manor was thick with suspicion. The guests gathered in the drawing-room, their faces pale and drawn, each casting furtive glances at the others. Lady Eleanor sat rigidly in an armchair, her hands clutching a lace handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. Clara, her daughter-in-law, stood by the window, her expression unreadable, though her eyes flickered with something Poirot could not yet name: fear, perhaps, or calculation. Richard Blackwood paced near the fireplace, his usual charm replaced by a nervous energy that set Poirot's instincts alight. Dr. Henry Walsh, ever the skeptic, sat with his arms crossed, his brow furrowed as he muttered about the absurdity of ghosts. Madame Celeste, the medium, was conspicuously absent, having claimed a headache and retired to her room. Captain Hastings, loyal as ever, hovered near Poirot, his notebook open, ready to jot down any observation his friend might share. Poirot stood at the centre of the room, his small, precise figure commanding attention despite the chaos of the storm outside. "Mies Amos," he began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority, "we are faced with a puzzle most intricate. 2 deaths, one by a dagger in a locked room, the other by poison in a private chamber. And yet the solution lies not in the supernatural, as some would have us believe, but in the tangible, the observable, the logical. The manor itself holds the key, and I, Hercule Poirot, intend to find it." Hastings leaned forward, his pen poised. "You think the manor's hiding something, Poirot? A secret room, perhaps?" Poirot's moustache twitched, a sign of his amusement at Hastings' enthusiasm. "Not a secret room, monsieur, but a passage, something that allows movement unseen. A thread that connects the impossible to the possible. We must explore, and we must observe." The group dispersed uneasily, each retreating to their own thoughts or tasks. Poirot, however, had no intention of wasting time. He beckoned Hastings to follow him to the library, the site of Victor's murder. The room, with its heavy oak shelves and musty tomes, seemed to pulse with secrets. The storm's lightning illuminated the space in brief, stark flashes, casting eerie shadows over the locked display case where the dagger had been kept. Poirot knelt beside it, his gloved fingers tracing the edges of the case. "The dagger," he murmured, "was taken from here. Yet no one saw it removed. The key was in Lady Eleanor's possession, and she swears it was not used. How, then, did it find its way into Victor's heart?" Hastings frowned, peering over Poirot's shoulder. "Could someone have picked the lock?" Poirot shook his head. "Nan, the lock is intact, and the mechanism is precise. No signs of tampering, but there is another way, Hastings. The manor is old, built in a time when secrets were as much a part of its architecture as its stones. We must look beyond the obvious." He moved to the bookshelf nearest the display case, his eyes scanning the titles. The books were a mix of classics and obscure volumes, their spines worn from years of handling. Poirot's fingers brushed against a particularly dusty copy of The Mysteries of Udolpho, and he paused. With a gentle push, the book tilted inward, and a faint click echoed in the room. To Hastings' astonishment, a section of the bookshelf swung forward, revealing a narrow, cobweb-laden passage. "Good heavens, Poirot!" Hastings exclaimed, stepping back. "A secret passage." "Precisement," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "This, mon ami, is the thread we seek. Let us explore." The passage was cramped, its walls damp and lined with moss. Poirot, ever fastidious, grimaced as he stepped carefully, his polished shoes avoiding the worst of the grime. Hastings followed, holding a flashlight borrowed from the manor's meagre supplies. The beam illuminated a winding path that descended slightly, then turned sharply to the left. The air grew colder, and the sound of the storm faded, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by their footsteps. After several minutes, the passage opened into a small chamber, barely large enough for two people to stand comfortably. The walls were bare stone, and a rickety wooden ladder led upward to a trapdoor. Poirot examined the latter, noting its worn rungs. "This," he said, "leads to another part of the manor. Let us see where." With some effort, Poirot and Hastings ascended the ladder, pushing open the trapdoor. They emerged into a narrow corridor behind a tapestry, which, when parted, revealed the balcony overlooking the manor's grand hall, the very balcony from which Charles Blackwood had fallen to his death a year ago. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. The balcony was exposed, with a low railing that offered little protection. Below, the marble floor of the hall gleamed dully in the storm's light. "Hastings," Poirot said, his voice low, "this is no coincidence. The passage connects the library to the balcony. Charles Blackwood's death, ruled an accident, was no such thing. Someone used this passage to reach him, to push him, perhaps, or to stage the scene. And now, Victor's murder, also in the library, also impossible points." "By Jove, you're right," Hastings interrupted, his excitement barely contained. "This explains how the killer got in and out without being seen." Poirot raised a hand, cautioning patience. "It explains the how, mon ami, but not the who or the why. We must proceed with care. The passage is a tool, but the motive lies in the hearts of those within these walls." They returned to the library, closing the passage behind them to avoid arousing suspicion. Poirot's mind was racing, piecing together the implications. The passage suggested premeditation, a plan that relied on the manor's secrets. Charles's death, Victor's murder, and now Mrs. Grayson's poisoning were linked, not by ghosts, but by human greed or vengeance. The missing Blackwood jewel, mentioned in earlier conversations, loomed large in Poirot's thoughts. Had Charles been killed for it? Had Victor known its location? And what of Mrs. Grayson, who had hinted at seeing Charles's ghost? Poirot decided to examine the passage further. He and Hastings retraced their steps, this time searching for clues within the hidden chamber. The flashlight's beam caught a glint in the corner small, velvet pouch tucked behind a loose stone. Poirot retrieved it, opening it to reveal a sapphire-encrusted brooch, its facets catching the light like a star. "The Blackwood jewel," he said softly, "hidden here where none would think to look." Hastings gasped. Then Charles's death, it was about this. "Perhaps," Poirot said, slipping the pouch into his pocket, "but we must consider all possibilities. The jewel is a motive, yes, but for whom? And why kill Victor and Mrs. Grayson? There is more to this than simple theft." Back in the drawing room, Poirot kept his discovery secret, knowing the killer was likely among the gathered guests. He observed their faces, noting Clara's clenched hands, Richard's restless pacing, Dr. Walsh's guarded expression, and Lady Eleanor's fragile composure. Madame Celeste, having rejoined the group, sat silently, her eyes darting nervously. Each had a motive: Clara's inheritance, Richard's estate, Dr. Walsh's affection for Clara, Madame Celeste's profit from Lady Eleanor's grief. The passage provided the means, but the heart of the mystery lay in the human element. Poirot announced his intention to inspect the manor's grounds, ostensibly to investigate the ghostly footprints Hastings had seen. In truth, he wanted to test the passage's other exits, suspecting it might connect to the garden. With Hastings and a reluctant Richard in tow, they braved the storm, finding a concealed grate near the manor's outer wall. The passage, it seemed, extended beyond the house, offering a route for someone to enter or exit unseen. The footprints Hastings had seen, which vanished abruptly, now made sense. They had entered the passage, leaving no trace in the soft earth. "This changes everything," Hastings said, his voice tinged with awe. "The killer could have come from outside, or someone inside could have slipped out." Poirot agreed, "but the killer is no outsider. The knowledge of this passage is intimate, known only to those familiar with the manor's secrets. We are close, Hastings, very close." That evening, Poirot sat in his room, the jewel hidden safely in his valise. The storm raged on, but his mind was calm, his little grey cells arranging the facts like pieces of a mosaic. The passage linked the library, the balcony, and the garden, making the impossible possible. Charles's death was murder, stage 2. Looked like an accident. Victor's death silenced his blackmail, and Mrs. Grayson's eliminated a witness. The jewel was the prize, but the killer's identity remained just out of reach. Poirot resolved to set a trap, to force the culprit's hand. He would announce his progress, provoke a reaction, and watch the guilty betray themselves. As the wind howled and the manor groaned, Poirot felt a thrill of anticipation. The case was no longer beyond reason, was within his grasp. Chapter 10: Motives and Alibis. The storm that had threatened Blackwood Manor since Poirot's arrival had finally broken, and the rain battered the ancient windows, filling the air with a restless drumming. Hercule Poirot sat in the manor's drawing room, his small, precise hands folded neatly over his waistcoat, his eyes gleaming with the quiet intensity of a man whose mind was at its sharpest. The fire in the grate cast flickering shadows across the room, illuminating the faces of the assembled guests, each of whom wore an expression of unease. The events of the past days, the séance, Victor's impossible murder, Mrs. Grayson's poisoning, and the persistent rumors of a ghostly presence had left them all on edge. But Poirot was not a man to be swayed by atmosphere. His little grey cells, as he so often called them, were hard at work, piecing together the puzzle of Blackwood Manor. Captain Hastings, seated near Poirot, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I say, Poirot," he whispered, leaning closer, "this place is giving me the creeps. All this talk of ghosts and secret passages, it's enough to make a chap jump at his own shadow." Poirot's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Mon ami, shadows are but the absence of light, and in this case I intend to bring much light to the darkness. We are close, Hastings, very close, to uncovering the truth." Across the room, Lady Eleanor Blackwood sat stiffly, her hands clutching a lace handkerchief. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from grief and sleeplessness. Beside her, Clara Blackwood, the widow of the late Charles, stared blankly into the fire, her delicate features betraying no emotion. Richard Blackwood, the charming heir to the estate, lounged in a chair with an air of forced nonchalance, though his fingers tapped nervously against the armrest. Dr. Henry Walsh, the skeptical physician, stood by the window, his arms crossed, his brow furrowed as he gazed out at the storm. Madame Celeste, the medium, sat apart from the others, her dark eyes darting between the guests, her assistant's death still a raw wound. The absence of Mrs. Grayson, the housekeeper, was a palpable void, her poisoning a grim reminder of the danger that lurked within the manor's walls. Poirot cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the room. "Madame et messieurs," he began, his voice calm but commanding, "we have reached a critical juncture in this affair. 2 deaths have occurred under this roof, Victor, stabbed in a locked room during a séance, and Mrs. Grayson poisoned in her own quarters. These are not the work of ghosts, as some would have us believe, but of a human hand, guided by motive and opportunity. Today I shall lay bare the motives and alibis of each of you, for the truth it hides in the details." Lady Eleanor's handkerchief trembled in her hands. "Monsieur Poirot, surely you don't believe one of us is responsible? The manor, it is cursed. My son's spirit, Nan, Lady Eleanor." Poirot interrupted, gently but firmly. "I respect your grief, but I assure you, the spirits do not wield daggers or administer poison. Let us begin with the facts." He rose from his chair, pacing slowly before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. "First, we consider the murder of Victor, Madame Celeste's assistant. He was stabbed during the séance, in a room locked from within, with all of you seated around the table. The dagger, taken from the manor's collection, was found in his chest, yet no one could have approached him without being seen. This is what we call a locked room mystery, n'est-ce pas? But every locked room has a key, not always a physical one, but a key of logic." Dr. Walsh snorted softly. "Logic? The whole thing's impossible. I was right there, and I swear no one moved from their seat." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "And yet, Doctor, someone did move or created the illusion that no one did. Let us examine the alibis. Each of you claims to have remained seated when the lights went out. Lady Eleanor, you were holding Madame Celeste's hand, and Clara, you were beside Lady Eleanor. Richard, you sat opposite Victor, with Dr. Walsh to your left. Madame Celeste, you were at the head of the table, leading the séance. Captain Hastings and I, we observed from the side, but we, too, saw nothing in the darkness." Hastings nodded vigorously. "That's right, Poirot. It was pitch black. I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face." "Precisement," Poirot said. "The darkness is the key. Whoever extinguished the lights created the opportunity for murder. But how was it done, and why?" He turned to Madame Celeste, whose expression was guarded. "Madame, you have admitted to using, shall we say, theatrical enhancements in past séances. Wires, perhaps, or other devices to create the illusion of supernatural phenomena. Tell me, was such a device used to extinguish the lights?" Madame Celeste's lips tightened. "I told you, Monsieur Poirot, I used a wire to move objects in the room, to make the séance convincing. But I did not touch the light. I swear it." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, I found a mechanism, a simple timer, hidden in the chandelier's wiring. It was set to cut the lights at the precise moment of the séance's climax. Someone knew the schedule of Madame Celeste's performance and used it to their advantage." A murmur rippled through the room. Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Are you saying someone tampered with the chandelier before the séance?" "That's absurd. Who would have the knowledge to do such a thing?" Poirot's gaze settled on Richard. "An excellent question, Monsieur Blackwood. Let us turn to motives. Victor, it seems, was not the innocent assistant he appeared to be. I have learned that he was blackmailing someone in this household, someone with a secret worth killing to protect. And what secret could be so grave? Perhaps it is tied to the death of Charles Black, whose fall from the balcony was ruled an accident, but which I now believe was murder. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. How dare you, Monsieur Poirot? My husband's death was a tragedy, nothing more. To suggest otherwise is cruel. Poirot raised a hand, his expression serene. Madame, I do not speak to cause pain, but to uncover the truth. Charles's death left you a wealthy widow, did it not? And the Blackwood jewel, missing since his death, would have added to your fortune. But there are others with motives. Monsieur Richard, you inherited the estate upon Charles's death, a fact that caused no small amount of tension with Clara. Dr. Walsh, I have observed the way you look at Madame Clarior. Affection for her is plain. Did you, perhaps, wish to protect her, or to remove an obstacle to her happiness? Dr. Walsh's face reddened. That's preposterous. I'm a doctor, not a murderer. I cared for Clara still do, but I'd never kill for her. And you, Lady Eleanor, Poirot continued, turning to the older woman, your grief for Charles is profound, but did you suspect someone in this room of causing his death? Did you hire Madame Celeste to uncover the truth, only to find yourself entangled in a new tragedy? Lady Eleanor shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I only wanted to speak to my son, to know he was at peace. I never imagined this. Poirot paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and a distant rumble of thunder underscored the tension. Each of you has a motive, and each of your alibis is, shall we say, less than ironclad. The lights went out for precisely 10 seconds, enough time for a practiced hand to act. But the dagger, it was locked in a display case. How did it come to be in Victor's chest? He turned to the display case, which stood against the library wall, its glass door now repaired after being shattered during the séance. The lock was forced, but not during the séance. I believe it was broken earlier, and the dagger was taken before the guests gathered. The killer brought it to the table, concealed, and used the darkness to strike. Hastings frowned. But Poirot, how could they move in the dark without anyone noticing? We were all holding hands, weren't we? Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Were you, mon ami? Or did someone break the chain, just for a moment? I have observed that the human mind, when distracted by fear or expectation, is not always reliable. Madame Celeste SSRN's was designed to create such a distraction, and the killer exploited it. He paced again, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. Let us consider the second death, Mrs. Grayson, poisoned with arsenic in her tea. She was a woman who knew much about this household, who perhaps overheard something she should not have. Her death was not random. It was a calculated act to silence her. The poison was administered hours before her death, likely in the afternoon. Tea she took alone in her room. Who had access to her tea? Who knew her habits? Richard stood abruptly, his face flushed. This is madness, Poirot. You're accusing us all, but you've got no proof. You can't just throw around suspicions like this. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Monsieur, I do not accuse without evidence. I observe, I deduce, and I follow the trail of logic. And the trail leads me to the secret passage I discovered behind the library bookshelf. passage that connects to the balcony where Charles met his end. This passage, it is the key to both murders. It allowed the killer to move unseen, to create the illusion of an impossible crime. Clara's voice was sharp. And what does this passage prove? That someone sneaked about the manor. It doesn't tell us who. Patience, Madame, Poirot said, raising a finger. The passage tells us much. It tells us that Charles's death was no accident, that someone lured him to the balcony and pushed him to his death. It tells us that Victor, who knew too much, was silenced before he could reveal his blackmail. And it tells us that Mrs. Grayson, who saw or heard something incriminating, had to be eliminated. But the passage alone is not enough. We must look to the heart of the matter, the Blackwood jewel. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The jewel, missing since Charles's death, is the motive that binds these crimes. It is a prize worth killing for, worth hiding for, and I believe it is still within this manor, hidden where only the killer would know to look. Madame Celeste spoke for the first time, her voice low. Monsieur Poirot, you think one of us has the jewel, but why kill Victor? He was my assistant, my friend. He would not steal from me. Poirot's gaze softened, but only slightly. Madame, Victor was not your friend. He was a man who saw opportunity in secrets. He discovered something, perhaps the jewel's location, perhaps the truth of Charles's death, and he used it to extort the killer. That is why he died. The room fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the relentless rain. Poirot's eyes swept over the guests, lingering on each face. Tomorrow, he said, I shall set a trap. I shall announce that I am close to finding the jewel, and I shall watch who reacts. The killer, they will not be able to resist revealing themselves. For now, I suggest you all retire to your rooms and lock your doors. As the guests dispersed, their faces a mix of fear and suspicion, Hastings leaned close to Poirot. I say, old chap, do you really think you'll catch the killer with this trap? It's a bit risky, isn't it? Poirot's smile was serene. Risk, mon ami, is the price of truth. But fear not, Hercule Poirot does not set a trap without knowing the prey. By tomorrow, all will be revealed. The storm raged on outside, but within Blackwood Manor, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of secrets, lies, and a murderer who could no longer hide from the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot. The drawing room was nearly empty now, save for Poirot and Hastings, who lingered by the fire. The air was heavy with the weight of suspicion, and Hastings could not shake the feeling that the manor itself was watching them. Poirot, he said, his voice low, do you really believe the jewel is still here, and that it's the key to all this? Poirot nodded, his eyes fixed on the dying embers. Oui, Hastings. The jewel is the thread that ties the past too. The present, Charles's death, Victor's murder, Mrs. Grayson's poisoning, they are all connected by greed. But greed, it is a clumsy master. It leaves footprints, even in the dark. Hastings shivered, though whether from the chill of the room or the weight of Poirot's words, he could not say. And the passage? You think the killer used it to move about during the séance? Precisement, Poirot replied. The passage is the secret heart of this manor, known only to a few. It allowed the killer to strike and vanish, to create the illusion of a ghost. But illusions, Hastings, they crumble under scrutiny. Tomorrow we shall shine a light on this darkness. He rose, adjusting his waistcoat with a precise tug. Come, mon ami, let us retire. The night is long, but the truth, it is near. As they left the drawing room, The storm howled outside, and the manor seemed to groan in response. Somewhere within its walls, the Blackwood jewel lay hidden, a glittering prize that had cost 3 lives. And somewhere among the guests, a killer waited, unaware that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were closing in. The next morning dawned grey and dreary, the rain having settled into a steady drizzle. Poirot was up early, as was his custom, his mind already racing through the details of the case. He stood in the library, examining the bookshelf that concealed the secret passage. The mechanism was simple, but clever, a hidden latch that, when pressed, released the shelf to swing open. The passage itself was narrow, lined with damp stone, and led to a staircase that ascended to the balcony where Charles had fallen to his death. Poirot traced his fingers along the stone, his expression thoughtful. "This passage," he murmured. To himself, "it is the artery of the crime. Through it, the killer moved unseen, carrying their secrets." Hastings joined him, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Found anything new, Poirot?" "Only confirmation, mon ami," Poirot replied. "The passage is not merely a convenience, it is the key to the locked room mystery. The killer used it to enter the library, to take the dagger, and to strike Victor in the darkness. But they made a mistake. They left a trace." He pointed to a faint scuff mark on the stone floor, barely visible in the dim light. "A shoe, perhaps, or the edge of a cloak. It is small, but to Poirot it is as loud as a shout." Hastings peered at the mark, frowning. "But whose shoe? Clara, Richard, the doctor?" Poirot chuckled softly. "Patience, Hastings. All will be revealed in time. For now, we prepare the trap." He returned to the drawing room where the guests were gathering for breakfast. The mood was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Poirot took his place at the head of the table, his demeanor calm but authoritative. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "I have an announcement. Last night I discovered the hiding place of the Blackwood jewel. It is within this manor, and I shall retrieve it before the day is out. The killer, they will not be pleased, for the jewel is the key to their motive." The reaction was immediate. Clara's fork clattered to her plate, her face paling. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. Dr. Walsh's hand froze on his coffee cup, and Madame Celeste's fingers twitched nervously. Lady Eleanor gasped, clutching her handkerchief. "The jewel," she whispered. "It's been found." "Not yet, Lady Eleanor," Poirot said, his voice smooth, "but soon. I suggest you all remain vigilant. The killer, they will act to protect their secret." The meal continued in uneasy silence, each guest casting furtive glances at the others. Poirot watched them all, his eyes sharp, missing nothing. He knew the killer was among them, and he knew they would not be able to resist the bait he had set. As the day progressed, Poirot kept a close eye on the guests, noting their movements, their conversations, their glances. He enlisted Hastings to watch the library, instructing him to report any unusual activity. "The killer will come, Hastings," he said. "They cannot help themselves. The jewel is their obsession, and they will seek to ensure it remains hidden." By afternoon, the tension in the manor was palpable. The guests avoided one another, their nerves frayed by Poirot's announcement. Clara excused herself early, claiming a headache. Richard disappeared into the study, saying he had business to attend to. Dr. Walsh busied himself with his medical bag, checking supplies with an air of distraction. Madame Celeste remained in her room, claiming she needed to meditate. Lady Eleanor wandered the halls, her grief a heavy cloak around her. Poirot, meanwhile, continued his investigation. Returning to the secret passage, he examined every inch, searching for further clues. Near the staircase, he found a small scrap of fabric caught on a jagged stone. It was fine silk, dyed a deep bluer color he had seen Clara wear the night of the séance. Interesting, he murmured, pocketing the fabric. The net tightens. That evening, as the guests gathered for dinner, Poirot made another announcement. "I have narrowed the hiding place of the jewel to the library," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Tonight, I shall search it thoroughly. I invite you all to join me, to witness the truth revealed." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but none refused. They followed Poirot to the library, where he began a meticulous search, moving books, tapping walls, examining the floor. He made a show of it, ensuring every eye was on him. But his true focus was on the guests, watching for the telltale signs of guilt as he reached the bookshelf that concealed the passage. He paused, his hand hovering over the latch. "This," he said, "is where the truth lies, not in ghosts, not in curses, but in the simple mechanics of deception." He pressed the latch, and the bookshelf swung open, revealing the dark passage beyond. A collective gasp rose from the guests. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, and Richard took a step back, his face pale. Dr. Walsh's eyes widened, and Madame Celeste whispered a prayer. Poirot turned to face them, his expression grave. "The passage leads to the balcony where Charles Blackwood died. It is also the path the killer took to murder Victor and to silence Mrs. Grayson, and it is where the Blackwood jewel is hidden." He stepped into the passage, beckoning the others to follow. They hesitated, but curiosity and fear drove them forward. The passage was cold and damp, the air heavy with the scent of stone and decay. Poirot led the way, his flashlight casting a narrow beam ahead at the staircase. He paused, pointing to the scrap of fabric he had found. "This," he said, holding it up, was torn from the killer's clothing as they moved through this passage. "It is a small thing, but it speaks volumes." Clara's face drained of color, her hand instinctively touching the sleeve of her blue silk dress. Poirot's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment the room was silent save for the distant drip of water. "Madame Clara," he said softly, "would you care to explain?" Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. I don't know what you mean. That could belong to anyone." "Perhaps," Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild. "But let us see what else the passage reveals." He continued up the staircase, the guests trailing behind. At the top, they emerged onto the balcony, where the wind whipped through the open air, carrying the scent of rain. Poirot knelt, examining the stone floor. He tapped a loose tile, and with a gentle pry, it came free, revealing a small cavity beneath. And there, glinting in the flashlight's beam, was the Blackwood jeweler sapphire the size of a pigeon's egg, set in an intricate gold pendant. Lady Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her heart. "My son's jewel. It was here all along." "Oui, Lady Eleanor," Poirot said, lifting the jewel carefully, "hidden by the one who killed Charles, who killed Victor, who killed Mrs. Grayson, the one who used the passage to move unseen, to create the illusion of a haunted manor." He turned, his eyes sweeping over the guests. "The killer is among us, and they cannot hide any longer." The tension was unbearable, the guests frozen in place, each waiting for Poirot to point the finger. But he said nothing more, merely, holding the jewel aloft, letting its facets catch the light. The trap was set, and the killer was cornered. All that remained was for Poirot to spring it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of suspicion and unease. The guests retired to their rooms, but sleep was elusive. Poirot remained in the library, the jewel locked in a small box he had procured from his luggage. Hastings sat with him, his revolver at the ready, though Poirot waved it away with a chuckle. "There will be no need for that, mon ami," he said. "The killer will come to us, not with violence, but with desperation." And come they did. In the early hours of the morning, as the manor lay quiet, Poirot heard the faint creak of the bookshelf. He signalled to Hastings, who dimmed the lamp, plunging the room into shadow. The bookshelf swung open, and a figure stepped into the library, moving silently toward the box. Poirot flicked on the lamp, revealing Clara Blackwood, her face pale, her hands trembling as she reached for the jewel. "Madame," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the silence. "It is over." Clara froze, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment it seemed she might deny it, but then her shoulders sagged and she sank into a chair, her face crumpling. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. "It was only supposed to be Charles." Poirot nodded, his expression sombre. "You pushed him from the balcony, to secure his wealth, to take the jewel. But Victor, he discovered your secret, and he blackmailed you. So you killed him during the séance, using the passage and the timed blackout to strike unseen. And Mrs. Grayson, she overheard your plans, so you poisoned her tea." Clara's tears fell silently, her confession a broken whisper. I couldn't let it all fall apart. The jewel was my security, my future. Charles was going to ruin everything, his debts, his recklessness. I had to act." Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "And so you acted, madame, and in doing so you destroyed lives. But the truth, it cannot be hidden from Hercule Poirot." He turned to Hastings. "Call the police, mon ami. The case is closed." As Clara was led away, the manor seemed to sigh, its shadows retreating. The Blackwood jewel was returned to Lady Eleanor, and the ghosts, if they had ever existed, were laid to rest. Poirot, as always, had brought light to the darkness, his little grey cells triumphant once more.